Start to take your seats. We'll start in a minute. Morena koutou, i ngā iwi, i ngā reo. Nau mai haere mai ki te kaunihira o Rotorua, ko Tania Tapsalaho no Te Aroa Ngāti Whakaue, and it is my absolute pleasure to be your chairperson for this term for the Operations and Monitoring Committee. I declare this meeting open, and I'd firstly like to acknowledge my predecessor actually, previous councillor Charles Stewart, for all the years that he gave to this community and as the previous chairperson. I would also like to take this moment to introduce my Deputy Chair, Councillor Mercia Yates, who is very capable and will fill this seat in the chance that I won't be here. So I welcome all councillors to our first meeting of the year, and also acknowledge our Te Tātou o Te Aroa representatives, Mr. Rawari Waru and Aroha Bray, and also our Community Board members from the Lakes Community Board, Jennifer Rothwell, and from the Rural Community Board, Mr. Bryce Hurd. And also congratulations to Rawari Waru for the birth of his daughter Faith. Congratulations. You'll notice there's been a few changes in this room since we were here last time. We got a brand new room. Now these refurbishments aren't quite complete. There will be a bit more work that's completed in the Easter weekend, particularly for the Galleria outside and also in the committee rooms. But this is work that has been well overdue, and actually I'm quite pleased to see our rooms that we used brought back up to scratch. We'll start this meeting off just by informing you that it is being live streamed, so I welcome all people tuning in and also acknowledge and thank the public who are in the Galleria for attending this meeting today. Just a reminder as well that all mobile phones, if you could please have them silenced and tucked away. If you are awaiting an urgent call, that is fine, just let us know and we'll deal with that then. But we will take a break around about 11 o'clock and also 12:30 for lunch. So we'll get straight into business, and I'll open up for any apologies. I have one apology for Councillor Raukawa Tate, who is in Waitangi at the moment. Are there any others? There appear to be none. I'll ask for a mover and seconder for the motion. Councillor Donaldson, seconded Mr. Waru. I put that motion to the vote. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. The motion is passed. We'll move to any declarations of interest. Does anyone have any declarations of interest for this agenda today? There appear to be none. We'll move to urgent items not on the agenda. Are there any urgent items that any members wish to raise? Yes, Councillor McPherson.
I wondered through you, Chair, if our Mayor would care to speak about the contingency plans with regard to coronavirus, the potential impact on Rotorua and how those impacts might be mitigated. Thank you.
It's perhaps not within our core business, but I will ask the Chief Executive to comment, given that the impacts could be large if it is here, but I understand that our health services are doing an excellent job to keep it contained. But Jeff, would you like to make any comments? Our Chief Executive.
Through the Chair, so the DHB is obviously operating currently a pandemic plan actually to actually look at control of the virus should it actually become present in New Zealand, and they have already been dealing with a number of instances where they've been put on alert to that effect. I think at this stage the likely impact on our broader economic activity is at this stage unknown. It's very difficult to predict, I think, for anyone as to where this precisely will end up. At this stage, Rotorua, Destination Rotorua, from a tourism point of view, is working with the tourism operators to understand where they are seeing the trends going, and they are all developing at this point assessments as to likely impacts and mitigation strategies. I think the tourism area is the most likely, obviously, to see change. I think the question at the moment, though, is that none of us have got a crystal ball to be able to precisely predict as to where this is actually going to go. So the focus at the moment is understanding what we're seeing, making sure that pandemic preparations are in place and that the DHB is well prepared to deal with any instances that arise in New Zealand. And then thirdly, the tourism sector in particular, as well as broader manufacturing export sectors, monitoring what is occurring and developing contingency strategies as things unfold.
Thank you, Chief Executive. Were there any other urgent items that members wish to raise? There appear to be none. We'll move to our first presentation of this morning. I'd like to invite Stavros Michael up to overview the presentation of transport and inner city parking. Thank you, Stavros. The floor is yours.
Morena tatu katoa. I will talk briefly about the inner city parking, and I would like first to traverse a couple of things before I get into the presentation, especially for those elected members that have not been here in the previous training, and especially at the time when we undertook the inner city parking review. Then I will talk a little bit about the evidence and the metrics we've got from our parking application in the CBD. And also we'll talk a little bit about what we have heard from the public and the business sector, or what we have observed ourselves, and how do we intend to address those issues as we go forward. For the vibrator, this sounds quite good. Just in terms of the context for the parking applications, the primary aim of parking services in the CBD aim to aid the economy in the city. Parking is a derived outcome that enables access into the CBD for people to get to their key destinations, especially business destinations, and make sure that the regulations we have and the way you apply the regulations and the way that the parking is operated aids and supports the business activation in the CBD. Another aim, of course, is to make sure that people who want to get to the CBD, they have a reasonable chance to have access to the key destinations and ensure that there is availability of parking. That is triggered by the targets we've got about vehicle spaces, parking spaces turnover. If, for example, we've got congested places where are fully occupied and someone wants to find a car park and they're constantly occupied, then obviously the availability of parking is not guaranteed, not assured by people. And the third aim, of course, is to make sure that the parking operation in the space, in the area under consideration, it is efficient. People can drive without congestion, and they can park in a safe way without actually impeding or endangering other road users, whether they are other drivers or other pedestrians or cyclists or disability scooters and so on. Again, I'll go back a little bit because that was one of the first areas of activities that I was asked to review when I came up to Rotorua in 2015. Between 2013 and 2015-16, there was an evidence and a strong business concern that the CBD was suffering from a decline in terms of its vibrancy. Council at that point in time had undertook a number of initiatives to see how could parking be improved to aid the inner city business economy. And for those of elected members who were here at the time, or most other of you who were just citizens at that time, an extensive trial took place between 2013 and 2015, where a free parking, a different kind of time limits and configurations of parking was undertaken. And that a review took part in the year 2015-2016 that involved extensive public consultation and a heavily involvement of the business sector through the block champions in the CBD to give us feedback as to what is the optimum configuration of parking services and parking regulations in the CBD. The principles that the consultation identified and recommended that the principles of short stay and high turnover vehicles for the CBD to be applied, because that ensures access and availability of parking spaces for those who need to be using. There was some strong concern that a lot of the parking on the streets were monopolized by workers who are staying there all day and denying access, to other customers for the services. At that point in time, it was an indication that the majority of users of the CBD services were staying in the CBD less than an hour. Those principles were presented and agreed by the Council in terms of the review. New regulations that were applied were, for the consultation identified, the main spine of the CBD would remain a 60-minute free parking. The balance of the CBD, core CBD, will be regulated, with time limitations up to 3 hours, but a payment of $1 per hour. For longer stays was to be encouraged to use the periphery of the CBD and to monitor the demand and apply the zone policy as it was agreed by the Council at that point in time. Another area that was considered during that review was the availability of spaces, equipment, and enforcement. Our enforcement through manual means was inefficient, and as a result of that, it was a high level of breaches of the regulations. We have identified there were 3,500 car parking spaces, public spaces in the CBD. Out of those 3,500 parking spaces, about 40% of them in the periphery and the core CBD remain free of charge, either in time limited or full all-day use. Also in the periphery, there are about over 4,000 private car parks. So the CBD is well served with parking spaces. It's not short of parking spaces. Also, what we identified, that it was that the equipment used, the parking meters became obsolete. We couldn't get spare parts to maintain them. The regime of reliability was not assured. And also an agreement at the review was that the enforcement practice needed to be improved to make sure that people abided by the rules, and also to apply the agreed policy triggers to ensure that an appropriate demand management was applied. So where was a high occupancy, high demand for a particular space, there were demand management measures either through time limitations or pricing regime to make sure we engineer the economic objective of ensuring high level performance and turnover of the vehicle spaces. This map here presents to you roughly and in a consolidated way what was the regulations that were agreed in the core CBD in the 2015-2016 review. As you can see, the orange-yellow spine is a 1 hour free time. To the east and west, we've got the 3 hour time limitations, and further to the periphery, we've got some all-day free parking, which expands all the way down to the lakefront and back towards the central mall. The modernization of equipment was initiated later on after a procurement process, and we began the installation in early to mid last calendar year. By May last year, the new equipment was in place and all the old parking meters were removed. You can see from the code up there that a decision was made to have a mix of hotspots or dispensing machines, I suppose, where people can purchase their parking permissions or pay for the fees, and then there was a mix of machines that take credit cards and machines who accept coins. There was some strong indication that coins should be phased out in a slow way. So we made sure that the disposition of these hotspot machines was such that would allow people easy access to them. Since May 2019, obviously, we have gradually given effect to the new equipment and to the new enforcement regulations. The first 7 months of the application identified a number of metrics and indications about the performance, of the system. Some of the evidence that we have in front of us, and again, these are supported by the evidence and the metrics we have available to us, is that obviously there is less clutter on spaces with by the old machines. The old machines are no longer, the parking meters are no longer there because, as I said, it could not continue to be maintained. The new application enables multiple payment options and not limited to coins, and again, it allows people to pay and walk away from the machine. They don't need to go back to their cars. They simply have to put, their registration number and pay the limits they need to pay and move forward. There's a better enforcement to meet policy objectives and to ensure we have improved equity of use. As I said, remember, one of the strong indicators by the business sector in 2015-16 was that it was a need to ensure that the parking spaces were available for customers and not for employees. The indications and the transaction metrics we've got for the last 7 months indicates that about 6,000 vehicles use the CBD core CBD parking spaces every day. We hear from time to time that the parking regime discourages people from coming into the CBD, and yet the metrics and the transactions and indications we have clearly show that every day there are 500 unique number plates identified in the CBD. That indicates that the 500 new vehicles that have not been encountered in the CBD before, they are encountered every day. But on average, for the period, 6,000 vehicles use all the core CBD parking spaces. The observed occupancy of parking spaces remains roughly at levels or better levels that it was during the trial. The occupancy of peak time is between 65 and 75%. That means a quarter of all available parking spaces are always available for users, for visitors to use it. In peak time, between the hours of 11 o'clock and 1 p.m., 75 to 95% occupancy, which means it is a high demand period of time. People take their lunch and go into the CBD. The transactions we have on a day-to-day basis accumulate between 40 and 50,000 per month. That means 40 to 50,000 transactions take place on the hotspot machines. Over a period of 7 months, close to about 300,000 transactions have been undertaken using the new machines. We may have the metrics with regards to faulty or reporting of faults on those transactions, which equate to about 0.2% of all transactions. And that level is declining. So the level of complaints regarding the functionality of the machines, although it started at a higher level at the beginning, now is trending to go below the 0.2%. The metrics again indicate very clearly that 70% of all infringements are paid on time. 70% of all transactions are made on credit cards, with 30% coins. They were about 12% of all the infringement notices waived voluntarily by the council and its agents, because we have identified some rationale for waiving the ticket. There are about 18% of these infringements that continue to be referred to court. And I would like to remind councillors or advise elected members that a significant number of those references to court relates to infringements, not just about not paying the parking fee or overstaying your time. It relates to warrants of fitness and registrations, for which we are acting as an agent of the government in that respect too. And significant number also of these infringements cases that are referred to courts are two people who appear to be repeat offenders, and they have a long history of actually not paying their fine. So therefore, the only realistic avenue is actually to go to court and seek, court assistance with it. Again, looking into, the overall issues and problems that we have encountered, out of the, 300,000 transactions we have over a period of time, there are about 2,400 disputes remaining unresolved. Those disputes relate to a number of reasons. Some people actually say that, look, I believe I've used the machine correctly, but the machine did not record my transaction. I believe that my credit card was charged, but there was yet I got an infringement notice for that. Where those kind of arguments are made, obviously the easy thing is to say, well, if we can see your credit card transaction, your bank transaction, it's easy to waive it because there's obviously it's a machine fault. Where it's a bit trickier is where people believe that they put coins into the machine and the transaction did not go through. And therefore, those transactions, out of the, as I said, of the 300,000 transactions, 2,000 cases are still outstanding to be considered. And I'll come later about what we propose to do about that. I think also we identified that we have an opportunity here to use the machines to provide a better information and advice to people. The other thing we have identified, of course, through the whole process is that long-staying parking, i.e. workers, have moved out of the CBD and into the periphery of the core center. Overall, looking objectively over the last 7 months, I think it'd be fair to say that the evidence and the metrics indicates a vast majority of people are finding the application of the parking regulations and how they pay for it and how they transact with it quite manageable. However, it is fair to acknowledge that for some people, if not, that is a step change. It's a new technology, it's a new methodology, and for some people, they found that that change, a little bit, challenging. The other thing that we found that is a little bit, it's a little justified to reconsider is that in the periphery of the CBD, where we have applied demand management and charge $1 per hour, for a worker that needs to stay for 8 hours, to pay $8 a day seems to be a significant cost imposition too. So the question arises as to, having due regard to the transactions, having due regard to the metrics, having due regard to what we observed and what have we listened from the community, what are we going to do, what are we doing to address the identified issues? One of the important things, obviously, because we get it regularly, is that can we get better information for the users? And we are working now with our partners, the service providers, and by the 23rd of February, we'll have new improved information on the screens, of the machines. We'll make it more simple for people to navigate through the process. We also will be undertaking a wider information effort. We will distribute and add to the machines manuals that clearly show people what they need to do. Some people appear not to be able to navigate through the process. If they get a tick, that means the transaction has been completed. If they get a cross, that means the transaction has not been completed. So we really need to make the effort. It's our duty of care to make sure that although those people represent a small percentage of all the transactions and users, I think it's our duty of care to make sure that we address those concerns. A new application, a new app on the phone would be ready by mid-February, so people can use that app and pay without actually having to go to the machine. We started those 2,400 disputes, as I mentioned earlier. we have decided that on balance, we will err on the side of caution and on the side of goodwill, and we will waive all those infringements of these disputed infringements that were a one-off infringement. They were first-time infringement notices. So by the end of March, all those infringement notices will be waived, except those who appear to be repeat offenders, and I think we cannot walk away from that responsibility. Also, we have given instructions to our parking wardens from the end of January. Now, when they identify an infringement on the core CBD parking and their machines indicates that this is a number plate that has not offended for the last 3 months, instead of issuing an infringement notice, we will be issuing a warning notice, and the warning notice will clearly outline what they need to do to comply with the regulations. We also recognize that the financial imposition on people who stay all day in the periphery of the CBD of $8 a day is a little bit too far, and we will immediately change our fees from $1 an hour to 50 cents per hour to make it a maximum of $4 per day for people to stay in the periphery. We will continue to apply in the periphery of the CBD the policy guidelines that this council has agreed, where the occupation of available parking spaces exceeds 90%, will apply demand management, and we will extend the hotspots or the machines in those periphery too, for 2 reasons. One is that it's a matter of equity, and the second reason, of course, is that the CBD is changing. The CBD, especially with lakefront development, is moving more towards the lakefronts, and parking in the periphery of that area needs to be managed in a way that ensures availability of parking spaces. If we don't take demand management approaches to that, it means in the future, in the near future, we will not have practical and available parking spaces for people to use in that particular area. Also, we need to recognize that in the northern part of the CBD, our streets, for example, we've got a new Pullman hotel who attracts a lot of attention. In the near future, we're going to have the Rotorua #1 hotel that is built up a little bit further up on our street, and apartments. So the nature of the CBD is changing, and I think we believe that our parking management practice and the regulations and the key outcomes pursued need to be managed carefully in a balanced approach. Again, we need to progress, all the additional parking options. Again, one of the areas that, we have identified that perhaps in the periphery of the CBD, we do not have enough parking spaces for long stays. We are discussing with other parties to create additional parking spaces on Hinemaru, off-road parking spaces to manage at a low cost, no more than $3 or $4 per day, and also exploring to the west, near Quiro Park to see whether we have an available space to create some additional parking spaces for long-stay users. And again, by the 17th of February, we're going to have new improved access to the Pokuatua parking, Council's parking building to make sure that people have got alternatives to parking, to parking onto the road. So on balance, when you put all the transactions, the evidence, the metrics we've got, the baseline is that in proportion to the total transactions, the rate of malfunctions, the rate of machine failures or the machine operation, and the rate of infringements is quite low compared to other, compared to other areas. The rate of complaints is dropping. And again, can I remind elected members that when we initiated the waste collection services back about 3 years ago, we moved from paper bags into wheelie bins. Initially, we were getting about 800 complaints a day. And of course, very soon after 3 or 4 months, those dropped to about 10 or 15 a day. And since then, our average complaint a day is somewhere between 5 and 10 complaints a day, from about 6,000 or 7,000 lifts, or collections each day. It's fully expected we're going to make a change to have these transactions transitional properties, but I think it's also fully expected of us to be cognizant of and sensible and sensitive and responsive to what we hear and what we observe. And we believe we are doing so. and therefore we'll continue to monitor and improve. Now, again, for your own benefits, this is a inner city parking area under the policy. The policy has been reviewed, reconsidered, and agreed and approved in 2015-2016, and that's the area, that is zone that it covers. Of course, when we talk about the CBD, most people think about the core CBD, which is enveloped to the west by Ranald Street and to the east by Fenton Street, to the south by Amahawa Street, and to the north by Arawa Street. However, the CBD central business area is covered by this area, and the policy applies in that area too. And therefore, in going forward, we will continue to manage it as one geographical area. Excuse me. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you for your presentation, Stavros. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, Mayor Chadwick.
For that, Stavros, and we were at the meeting where we heard a lot of the issues that all of us have felt as councillors, I'm sure. The one issue that I don't think the public realises is who sets the level of fines and infringement. And the disability park has shocked people when they've infringed there, and I said, well, you shouldn't park there, but it's very, very high. But that's set by central government, isn't it?
Correct. The levels of infringement penalties are, as a government said, practice we just applied.
And so following on from that, yet we're able to change to do it our own way for the $8 a day for workers down to $4. So that's our authority.
That is, definitely that is a council's authority, council's decision, and of course it's dictated by your own funding and revenue policy considerations, and you can adjust, the rate, to the level, you think is appropriate.
And my last question, if I may, is just about the education. That's what we learned about probably people like my generation, and all of us helping people who are a little bit stuck. What are we going to do about that ongoing education of the public? Because the change was big, and still we're all helping people to get to grips with finish your transaction, and then you'll be right. And I see a few struggling with that, so education.
Yeah, Your Worship, you are correct. As I said, in proportion to the overall users, I think, those comments and observations and feedback we have, it relates to a small portion of the population. However, we, as I said, by the 23rd of February, we will have a modified screen, set of instructions. We put on the machines themselves a manual which clearly walks people from, steps, how to get there. And we'll continue to use our parking wardens and all our available staff who are available on site to help people as they can. We will talk to the business sector to give them the same kind of information so they can assist their customers. But at the same time, I would like to remind all of us that, if you go, the banking sector has changed to ATMs for a number of years, and gradually we're getting used to these machines. So you go to warehouse, supermarket, or any large store at this point in time, you are encouraged to self-serve. You pay your own for your own products and services you purchase. And yes, you are absolutely right. There are some people, especially of a older generation, that might find it a little bit challenging. So it's our responsibility to continue to identify and find ways to better inform them, better assist them. I'm not sure if we can find the magic bullet here and today to say we'll cover every individual, but nevertheless, it's our duty of care to continue to work with us and do everything we can to inform and educate.
Very good questions. We have Mr. Waru.
Kia ora te tiamana, ka ora te kite a iawe e nohona. Hoi morena tātou. Stavros, thank you for your report. Good information there. However, I've got a few questions. So you mentioned 6,000 people per day are using the...
6,000 vehicles per day.
6,000 vehicles per day. And is that number only, does that come from the parts in town where you are paying, or is that count, I'm talking about the central mall and stuff too, is that all, are those numbers included?
No, it only covers the area of the core CBD where our regulations apply.
Okay, go away. Just so I get just trying to be clear in my head, before the introduction of the new parking system, what were the numbers then, if you have it offhand?
Well, the numbers we had earlier are really not inconsistent with that numbers. You know, and again, the 2015-2016 review identified that some areas had a significant monopolization of parking spaces by workers. Remember? Okay. And that's why council, I didn't do it, the council, with the business sector agree to apply the new regulations. The point was that the numbers of vehicles using the core CBD before the 15-16 regulations were lower because the occupancy was higher because workers were monopolizing the space for a longer period of time.
Copy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wari. I think that's actually a good point because the Pokero Orowhata with their more car parking, we do know have taken on a lot of impact of additional people using that as free parking. So thank you for raising that. I have Councillor Donaldson followed by Councillor Bentley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Stavros, just looking at the policy area, there are a number of public spaces there that on a weekly basis I'm having freedom camping drawn to my attention. Is dedicated spaces for freedom camping, and I talk about the likes of Motatara Point and out in front of the Sudima and even Kuirau Park. Is that covered under this policy, or is that a separate policy that determines where that parking will be managed, and how do we enforce that? I know it's not part of the iPark contract.
Deputy Mayor Donaldson, yeah, I think sort of especially with regards to freedom parking and so on, I think our parks and reserves policies cover that there too. I think the iPark, our agent, remember iPark is just our agent applying our regulations. They don't set regulations, we set the regulations. I think obviously for the last year or so, we've focused attention in transiting the modernization of the equipment and the enforcement policies. But again, as we apply the regulations and we monitor and observe, I think it's quite important also to monitor and observe what's happening in the general policy area. And if we need to change the current regulations, the practices, or whatever it is, it's something that we need to take on board and have a look and see what we can do. At the end of the day, it's elected members, this council, who decides what regulations you want to apply. We can provide you with the information and the numerics and the metrics and the statistics and some recommendations, but it's up to you to make that call.
Councillor Bentley.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your report, Stavros, and I appreciate the fact that it's come forward at this time and that I have passed my concerns on about the parking situation for several months now. One of my main concerns is that we've forced the staff that work in these shops further and further away from the city centre to seek free or nearly cost-free parking, of which we have had a report recently of one of those people being assaulted on their way home, which doesn't do anything for inner city safety, as you may appreciate. The fact that you have credit card facilities and you draw the parallel with ATMs that are now in everyday use, a lot of the issues that we're suffering with this present parking system would be rectified, I believe, if people were allowed to use FPOS rather than credit card facilities. I, for example, don't carry a credit card at all, and if I was to pay for parking, I would be in a bit of a quandary because I probably can't be bothered walking the distance to find a coin machine, quite frankly. The system of these machines that you have to attend, 90% of them are exposed. So if it's raining, it's extremely uncomfortable for people to try and understand what they're supposed to be doing if they're not familiar with the system. And more than often they give up in disgust and wander away and run the risk of their $40-odd fine.
Councillor Bentley, I beg your pardon, but do you have a question?
My question is, Madam Chair, that it has taken a long time to come to this point in time that we actually appear to be recognising there is an issue with parking, and when are we going to make it user-friendly so that people can enjoy coming to town once again rather than avoid it?
Point of order, Madam Chair.
We have a point of order, Mayor Chadwick.
I just heard all the remedies that were given to us about phone apps and ongoing continuous review. And I heard some very good mitigation of the problems that we've all identified. I want to see it done continuously. And it was only brought in May last year. So this is about the right time to look at it and have the metrics presented to us. We've all had your concerns, and I think we're going to keep getting them and feed them through to the Chief Executive as part of a review. The question was answered.
The question was answered, but there wasn't necessarily a question, so I don't believe that requires a response from the manager. Thank you, Councillor Bentley. We'll move to Councillor Kaifong, then Councillor McPherson and Mr Waru.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Steph, was just a question around the difference between paying with cash and with a credit card. So people have said to me, you know, happy to pay with cash, but gee, having to pay another 50 cents to pay by credit card. And if you go to the supermarket and you pay for your groceries by cash or by credit card, you pay the same fee. I'm assuming that's a recovery of a credit card transaction fee. Is the solution perhaps $1.10 and then everyone pays the same amount and that's a perception thing, or is there some other way of managing the perception for the public?
I think it's it's a fair point, and I think we need to sort of apply some thinking to it, because the 50 cents covers the transaction costs, the banking fees, the readers or the banking or the card and so on. However, if you absorb it into $1 per hour, actually it impacts on your funding and revenue policies, because you're making some assumptions of a certain revenue from that, which offsets the demand on rates, at some point in time. But in terms of optics, probably it doesn't look as good. And I think we need to look into sort of normalizing or equalizing a parking fee that includes it as one fee instead of having two different sort of levels. But if we do that, that means we have to adjust the cash, the coins payments too. And we have taken that on board, and we will do some work and apply it. The policy that this council has agreed in 15/16 allows us as officers to apply the policy parameters and implement measures, provided we'll let you know what to do and why we do it, without actually, initiating a significant sort of permission report, to be undertaken. But we're taking on board these concerns and we'll work on it.
Councillor McPherson.
Thank you, Chair. I really appreciate the report that you've given. Thank you very much. Where will this report be made accessible to the public?
Well, this is a public meeting. And
yes, the minutes will be released online.
Yeah,
yep.
And with the report,
and with the live streaming.
With the report attached, because some of the detail of the report is extremely helpful. I particularly appreciate the metrics that are being used. I'd like to look through those and understand the extent and nature of the evaluation being done. Much appreciated. My question then follows, because I understood that this report was to do with, I think it was referred to as a traffic functionality review late last year. Different report? Okay, then I'll reserve the question. The question that was a driving concern back then was, will the 70-odd parking spots in Hinimoa Street for the CBD cycleway be retained or returned parking? So perhaps I can put that question up and leave it there for when your functionality review comes through.
Yeah, Councillor McPherson, you're absolutely right. We will come to you with some options for discussion, and at the end of the day, we'll have some recommendations, and you may choose to agree with them or not. But we'll comment.
Thank you.
Thank you. And just a reminder, this is a presentation, but the presentation will be available online, as are all presentations following the meeting. We have Mr. Waru, Mrs. Bray, Councillor Wayne and Councillor Yates, and we'll wrap up this discussion. Mr. Waru.
Kia ora, tēnā anō rā tātou. Two quick questions, Stavros. Is there any data that shows the split between cash and card? What's being used most?
Yes, 70% of payments, all payments made by card, 30%
70.
by cash. 70.
How about my second question is, and I'll speak directly to the report. It's clear that the revenue is an issue with the parking, but now with all the information you've started to gather and everything, do you think there'll be a possibility of actually making a forecast on what you could possibly be getting over a certain period of time with parking?
Yeah, I think so. After 7 months of transition, I suppose, and application of the new equipment, now we start accruing enough metrics to give us a better an ability to better forecast. The average revenue you can expect from that.
Sorry, I lied. I have got one more question. So the fee for the card, 50 cents, I think Councillor Kaifong mentioned. Does that go to, or where does that go to?
It's a cost that we incur, we pay to people who provide the card readers, the banking sector, and things like that. It's not money we keep.
Because when you add it up, it's quite a bit with the numbers you're giving. So I just thought, kia ora.
Mrs. Bray.
Kia ora, Stavros. It was really pleasing to hear that you've identified lots of issues that the community have and you're working on some solutions. My question is, are you intending to phase out the usage of coins? Because if so, I'd be very concerned for 90% of the Rotorua community.
Through you, Madam Chair, no, we're not phasing out the coins. As I said, we've made what we believed was a balanced approach to make sure that there are hotspots or machines in the same area. We can use a credit card or a coin, and we'll continue to do that.
Councillor Wang.
Thank you. Thank you, Stavros, for your presentation as well. And it's good to see that, there will always be a few teething issues, but it's good to see that we are making the appropriate changes. I just had a question here that Councillor Bentley raised earlier as well, regarding the parking machines being exposed, and that is because the machines are solar powered, right? Yeah, and that's very good to see that, we're focusing on that sustainability as well.
That's correct.
Thank you. And one more. There's a few members of the public that are saying that iPark aren't very easy to deal with regarding, if they're contacting them regarding a certain infringement. How are we dealing with these issues?
As I said earlier, I think iPark are our agents. They apply the regulations and the standard operation procedures we have asked them to do. I think we are responsible for those operational procedures and regulations. I have no doubt that some people might not like the response they get in terms of those SOPs. As I said earlier, that for those 2,000 infringements in disputes, we will demonstrate a goodwill and waive them. Going forwards, IPAC and their enforcement officers will apply a leniency, or instead of issuing a infringement from the first offence, we will issue a warning notice. However, again, in the context of 40 to 50,000 transactions and contacts every month, I have no doubt there are very small number of people who never get happy about, the conduct they've got. Our aim is to overcome that as much as we can.
Thank you, and we'll conclude with Councillor Yates.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Kia ora no kia koe, Stavros. I've enjoyed also the metrics in here, especially given the recent hype there's been around our parking in particular. Picking up on a point that Mayor Chadwick spoke about around the education, and I noticed in the previous picture that you had up there around the zones, I certainly hope that there's possibly more education also about the blue and green zones, because that can be quite confusing. Some people might pay in the green and then move to the blue and be ticketed and not be aware that there are those zones in place. So would there be greater communication and education about that as well?
Yeah, Councillor Yates. I think sort of the comprehensive picture we hear and we learn from this exercise is that there are some members of the public that still need to be better informed. So the challenge is not to us to find the best ways to inform them.
Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes that presentation. I thank you, Stavros. For those who are unaware, Stavros Michael is our Infrastructure Group Manager. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to the staff reports, which begin on page 7 of our agenda. We have recommendation 1, which is financial performance for the 6 months ended 31st of December 2019. I call for a mover and a seconder to receive this report. Councillor Kai Fong, seconded by Councillor Wang. And that is that the report titled Financial Performance for the 6 months ended 31 December 2019 be received. I put that motion to the vote. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Welcome, Thomas Calais. If you'd like to please overview the report now.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, councillors and board members. I think this is the first opportunity in the new triennium to give you a financial update with regards to the performance of council, and this is the 6-month update to the end of 31 December. Where is this one? And happy to, I've got about 10 slides, and happy to have all the questions at the end if that's okay. So the performance to date. We're tracking a little bit behind budget. We're experiencing some of the same pressures that we saw last year. However, that with regards to our costs, and in particular electricity and staffing pressures, and in particular in the compliance and regulatory areas. However, they are being partially mitigated and offset by stronger revenues. One off the back of, again, a hot summer, and revenue from water by metre is up. Some strong rates revenue and some other sundry revenues helping offset it. Unfortunately, it's not fully mitigating, so overall we are tracking about 2% behind budget at this stage. So revenues themselves are close to $500,000 better than budget. Again, the water improvement to rates, improvement to bad debt collection, and parking revenues, while they're improving, they're still lagging behind budget. And just be aware that there was an uplift in the budget target for parking revenue in this financial year on the previous financial year. So it's very hard to obviously see that financial improvement in that area, while it still unfortunately lags a little bit behind budget. It is one of those areas where I think one of the councillors asked around the forecasting of that. In light of some of the proposed changes that are being discussed and implemented, we'll forecast how we anticipate that line item to end at the end of the year. On the operating expenditure front, tracking about $1 million over budget. In the main, electricity has been a contributing factor once again. Now, I'm sort of pleased to say, but not pleased to say, that we did enter into a fixed price agreement in December last year. So while we have stabilised the price fluctuations, which are continuing to happen, we're now focusing on obviously mitigating the extra cost of that and managing the usage to drive the usage down as well. So obviously what we have done is similar to a mortgage. We've gone from a floating mortgage, or in buying electricity on the spot price. Unlike a mortgage though, electricity reprices, can reprice hourly, and so as the demands and the generation demands peaked, we were seeing some extremely high pricing, and we have entered into a fixed price arrangement, so it's sets the electricity price just like you and I would have at home. However, it's not as simple as that you and I have at home. It is fixed pricing for certain hours of the day. And so we're now into that regime. So again, we'll see a bit of stabilisation in that area, but we will continue to experience some financial pressure for over the remainder of the year. Staffing, so we're seeing some extra demands in the regulatory and compliance area, so where we've had to take on new staff in response to the demands there. A little bit of additional revenue is helping offset that, and what we're also experiencing is just across the board some recruitment costs. So as our natural turnover of staff and recruiting the talent that obviously we require, some of the recruitment costs associated with that are just a little bit higher than probably anticipated, saying that the calibre of the candidates obviously warrant those extra recruitment costs. And then there is a one-off payment at the moment in the waste water area with regards to securing the land for the wastewater pump stations at Rotorua. There is a property sale that will be used to offset that, and that's the land that was acquired many, many years ago for siting of the wastewater station out at Rotorua, which wasn't used, and so that land will be disposed and it will be used to offset that one. So that one will hopefully mitigate itself by the end of the year. And we'll give you an update, obviously, of how we progress on that land sale in due course. When you look at it from an activity point of view, you'll see there that there's mainly two activities that are experiencing the financial pressure. So the planning and regulatory, where the parking side sits, and sewerage and sewage, where, as you can imagine, the wastewater treatment plant and all the associated pumping stations predominantly drive a lot of our electricity spend. And so in the main, when you cluster or group council activities into those that we have shown in our annual plans and long-term plans, you'll see that overall the pressures sit mainly in those two, and the waste management is obviously the landfill one. Refuse collection. It's not the landfill that's driving the issue. What we're seeing is higher volumes of refuse in the wheelie bins being collected, and so therefore there's a slightly higher cost associated with that. And on top of that, the recycling component, as it's more difficult to get rid of the recycling material, we're seeing some cost increase and pressures in those areas as well. And as you're aware, that's on the back of places like China and some of those other Southeast Asian countries that are closing their doors with regards to receiving recyclable material from other countries. With regards to our capital spend, so we do have a $91 million program this year. It's a substantial program. Just be aware that there's 5 key projects that make up well over half of that program. So Rotorua sewerage scheme accounts for about 20 million. The museum earthquake strengthening, the Sir Howard Morrison Performing Arts Centre earthquake strengthening, the lakefront development, and the Whakariwariwa forest development. So 3 of those 5 are well underway now, with the museum and the Sir Howard Morrison Performing Arts Centre hopefully kicking in earnest very, very shortly. We're also now into the middle of the peak, I guess, construction period. So you'll see now a lot of roadworks going on and berms being dug up with water mains and sewers being replaced. So it is that typical construction period for Rotorua, and it's just, for those that aren't familiar with it, that when Rotorua gets a bit cold during the winter period, it's obviously very hard to do those types of work. And so we will therefore see a significant uplift in our capital expenditure over the coming months. To reframe the capital expenditure a bit slightly different, so where it's clustered, so as you can see there, you can see the spend in the sport, rec and environment. So that's the group of activities that covers the Waka Forest project and the lakefront, and also has a substantial program with regards to renewal of some of its infrastructure. In particular, there's been a focus on boat ramps and abolition blocks in some of our parks and reserves. Arts and culture is the clustering of predominantly the museum and the Sir Howard Morrison Performing Arts Centre. So you'll see there that there's little spend against that at the moment, but in the coming months we anticipate that will increase significantly. Sewerage and sewage is the spend to date predominantly across the Rotorua scheme, but also the underlying infrastructure, the renewal of the network. Roading, as you can see, is a substantial capital investment per annum, and the spend there just reflects the fact that prior to Christmas, the team get all those programs underway, and all those programs are now well underway and will continue over the next few months. So cash and debt. It's not something I've shown often, but our debt at the moment is 223 million. It's up. Underlying debt is only up 2 million actually on the start of the year, and the reason being is that it's actually up 17 million, but 15 million of that was used to pre-fund our borrowings, and so it's held on term deposit at the moment. And so the underlying increase is only 2 million, and that's against a planned increase of 36.2. And as you're aware, the bulk of that 36.2 is investing into things such as the museum, performing arts centre, some of those key projects. Rotorua is another one that's driving a significant portion of that borrowing. And the reason that we pre-fund is that we look at our borrowing requirements. We look at what the sector does with regards to going to the market to place its borrowing, and we use the opportunity to pre-fund our borrowing. So we know that we've got 15 million maturing in the next month. We went to market early because the rates were favourable, and we've put it on term deposit. And as an example, that 15 million is being borrowed at roughly 1.9% and has been invested in term deposit at 2.7%. So we're getting a roughly 0.8% gain, and as that debt matures, that term deposit will mature and will be used to retire the debt and replace it. So it's key. The underlying debt increase at the moment is only 2 million. And you can see from this our profile of our borrowing. We've transitioned over a number of years to our debt profile maturing in a 4-year period, and this just represents how our debt is set to mature over the coming 10 years. And as we've stretched, we've been able to access 10-year borrowing rates through the local government funding agency at quite good margins, and we're seeing our cost of borrowings reducing substantially as we retire older debt at higher rates and replace it with debt at lower interest costs. So the forecast for the year. We anticipate at this stage that while the electricity pressures will continue, the parking revenues will continue. We're actively working to ensure that towards the end of the year we'll offset that. So we anticipate at this stage that the operating result will be on budget. Capital expenditure, we're already forecasting 9 million less than planned, mainly driven by the 3 projects that I've mentioned there, the timing of the Sir Howard Morrison Performing Arts Centre. The Aquatic Centre refurbishment has been rephased, so we're targeting the 50 metre pool improvement over this winter, and then the building itself the following financial year. So we've just changed the phasing of that project. And the Rotorua scheme is seeing a portion of that spend deferred into next year as well, while they work through some decisions around the on-site treatment options that they're currently working through for the Rotorua part of it. So as a whole, with the operating result being anticipated to be on budget and the capital spend being roughly 9 million less, we therefore anticipate at this stage to borrow approximately 9 million less than planned as well. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Thomas Colley. Councillor Donaldson, then Mayor Chadwick.
Thanks for the presentation, Thomas. I just had a question regarding depreciation and the revaluations driving higher costs there, higher than anticipated. So those asset revaluations, when are they done? And how do we mitigate the not being able to anticipate them coming in higher or lower than anticipated?
It's a very difficult one to anticipate. So when we prepare our long-term plan, we know that we have to revalue our asset base at least once every 3 years. And so we put assumptions around that anticipated revaluation change, and we model it into the LTP and fund it appropriately. And so obviously, as our assets are revalued on that 3-yearly cycle, the anticipated cost, therefore, of replacing an asset that goes up in value needs to change and increase with the same amount. We have had a challenge in the last couple of years whereby our asset revaluations for our water network and wastewater networks were substantially higher than anticipated. And so as a result, at the next LTP, which will be commencing hopefully in about 9 months' time, we will therefore see an uplift required in our renewal spending to match that. And obviously that will have funding implications that we'll have to work through at the next LTP. But predominantly, as those assets are revalued, and if the increases are higher than we anticipate, the increased cost of that in our renewal base is not normally felt from a funding perspective until the next LTP.
Mayor Chadwick?
Thomas, actually quite a peaceful summer, really, when you think back of the year before with the adverse weather event over summer, and there was a bit over Christmas. But the summer safety campaign in the inner city, that's required an increase in our regulatory spend, hasn't it? Is it a big material impact? Because certainly it's been a lot quieter. So it seems too early, but it seems to have worked to a degree. But has it cost us much?
That has been a substantial investment into that area, and I think as well what we're seeing as part of the annual plan forums going forward, we'll see probably a question of whether further investment will be required as well. Yeah. But I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but yes, it has been a substantial investment in that area.
So we see that
on
next
top of
quarter.
Yeah, and it was all unplanned and unbudgeted at the time. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Waru.
Kia ora, Thomas. $9 million, I think that's what you had up there, was the savings, or the $9 million less borrowing. That's correct there? Just wondering, did that come out of drop in prices or something, or was it because it's been deferred to, some of the works have been deferred to another year?
So that there is purely on the deferral and the timing change of those 3 projects.
Okay. Kia ora. Last question was, you mentioned the surplus lands out at Rotorua. You know I'm a big fan of land. And so just wondering, would there be an approach to our Ngāti Piki relations out there to tuatahi, firstly, before any other thing goes forward?
So the challenge with that one...
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, the challenge there is more, would have been acquired under the Public Works Act, and so we'll have to follow the disposal process of the Public Works Act, at which point it has to be offered back to the original owner first, and then obviously if they do not accept, then we can go for another process, in line with our property disposal policy. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McPherson?
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate your report, Thomas. Thank you very much. I particularly enjoyed the tactics of rephasing projects, smart move, and the second was pre-funding debt. That's potentially a nice way of easing potential pressures on ratepayers. Can I look through at the electricity contract? That's going to be a fixed price contract. That will help get expenses back on budget, I take it. Would it also provide an opportunity for rebudgeting? Assuming that consumption remains a variable.
Yep. So it removes some of the uncertain volatility because we have certainty on pricing, and obviously we are focusing therefore on consumption. With regards to the rebudgeting, yes, that's been a focus in the draft annual plan that we're currently putting together for next year, and when the right time at the right forum, you'll see, we'll give you some indication of how we've dealt with that pressure going forward.
Good, thank you. The next question concerns, on page 8, there's reference to stormwater expenditure. Recognising that continues to be a major impediment to residential development, will not this level of expenditure need to change significantly, again, possibly in outgoing years?
Certainly, and I think there's an item further on in the agenda that will provide some indication of the level of spend that we're anticipating on undertaking shortly, yes.
Good. Thank you very much.
Councillor Kaifong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thomas, just a question. You mentioned about the waste collection and the budget blowout there. And perhaps this might be more a question for Stavros, but what's the mitigation to stop more rubbish going in the wheelie bins than what you're anticipating? And I assume part of that is around green waste, if I see that mentioned somewhere else in the papers.
Perhaps if I could suggest, Stavros, if you want to, we'll save that question for the non-financial report, and Stavros will be able to go into detail on that for you, Councillor Kaifong.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Yeah. Mr. Hurd.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thomas, of the $91 million capex total, do you have a figure on how much is being spent on tar sealing rural roads, new tar seal?
I understand the budget is about 800,000 to $1 million.
Thank you.
Were there any further questions? No, okay. I might suggest that we take a quick 5-minute break now before we head into the next aspect of our report. So we'll adjourn again in 5 minutes, so there's a chance for you to refresh yourselves and also check your phones if you need.
Happy with things?
Yeah, it's going good.
Yeah.
Nothing to base it on.
No, it's good. So in the non-financials, Rob will come up and report about the late stuff.
Yeah.
He will most probably mention those things that he's been doing with us.
Good.
But, ask a question. So fantastic. We're so happy with the work that he does with us.
Okay, welcome back everyone. We're now on page 10 of our agenda, which is recommendation 2 of non-financial performance for period from the 1st of July to 31st of December. I'd like to call for a mover and a seconder to receive this report. Councillor McPherson, seconded by Councillor Maxwell, and that's that the report titled Non-Financial Performance for period 1st of July to 31st of December 2019 be received. I'd put that motion to the vote. All those in favour, please say aye. Those against? Carried. And I'll just invite Una Hopkins to overview the report.
Tēnā koutou katoa, everyone, and welcome. I thought before we launched into the detail of the actual measures, it would be worth spending just a couple of minutes, and I'm going to do so in a few PowerPoint slides, just to give the background for where the non-financial performance managers come from, and a little bit of background about how they are developed. So the performance management framework is developed as part of the long-term plan, and the current long-term plan was adopted took effect on the 1st of July 2018. They track the performance of the services that Council has agreed with its community to deliver. And within that framework, there are a series of mandatory measures or mandatory activities that we as a council have to use to describe some of the activities that council undertakes. And those are around the roading, water supply, stormwater and sewerage activities. So within those activities, the measures that are provided are mandatory. So any council annual report that you pick up would have the same levels of service and the same measurement methodology for those measures. All other services of council can be described and grouped together however the council chooses they wish to do so. And commonly you will group a series of outcomes or outputs that have similar commonalities into an activity that then describes what the council is providing. So for our council, we have grouped all of our activities into 10 different activity plans, and those are listed above. And coming out of that then is our performance management framework, a list of measures and targets that we're setting to achieve, and there are 62 of those measures. In terms of reporting, the performance measures are reported through to the Operations and Monitoring Committee on 3 occasions a year. So we cover off Q1, Q2 and Q3, and those reporting periods are up there on the screen for you.
then the last quarter is incorporated into the overall performance reporting, which is done through the annual report and then adopted in October of each year. So in addition to the council's activities, the council-controlled organisations, or CCOs, they also do their own reporting, and that comes separately to this committee as well on a number of occasions during the year. And their performance measures are directly related to their statement of intent. So just at a really high level, the results for the end of quarter two, so this time round we're actually grouping quarter one and quarter two results together, and that is this time round due to the election being held in October and then the formalisation of committees. As you'll recall, that didn't happen until the end of the year in December. So of the 62 measures that we have, 49 of those have currently been measured and 32 of those are on track. And that puts us sort of slightly behind the same period compared to last financial year. 10 of those measures do require some attention, so the managers themselves have some mitigation plans in place on how to bring those measures back on track. And 7 of those are unlikely to be met. And there's a number of reasons for those. Sometimes things like the data sets that we've intended to use are now not available to us, or legislation has also changed, which then requires that that whole tracking of a service or the way it's done is no longer relevant or is the same as what it was intended to when we set the measure. And this is just another graph to show you how the results are looking at this stage, activity by activity. So what we'd like to do now is, I think, just work through each of the activities, and if you have any questions on where that level of service or its performance is currently tracking at, we would look to invite the manager who is directly responsible for that activity to make comment. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Una, and that's just a bit of a helpful background about why we structure it this way. So were there any questions on that? Otherwise we'll move through to our operational groups. There appear to be none. So, oh sorry, Councillor McPherson.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've noticed that the indicators by LTP activity groups is quite specific. It's been well geared. On the other hand, why do the structures of the LTP activity groups not cohere with the structures of the lead appointments of councillors? There seems to be a form of structural incoherence. I thought for the question to be left on the table, perhaps for the CE.
Yes, I'm not sure if it's a chief executive requires to answer that. I do understand what you're saying, though. The appointments have only recently been made. This is a structure that we've had previously. So it's a bit of an update on how we're doing it now, but we do anticipate that moving forward, the performance indicators for those portfolios will also be there, and they'll be structured to represent the portfolios and lead roles which have just been appointed towards the end of last year. So we'll definitely acknowledge the question that you've raised. It has been raised by another elected member as well, and I do see that moving forward, our operational report and the non-financial performance will clearly show where the portfolios and the leads fit into that as well. Were there any other questions on that?
We don't have portfolios anymore, and so I agree with Councillor McPherson that in future, and I'm sure it's when we sit down with the annual plan, we'll want to see the 4 well-beings and then where the livable communities and our major projects fit. But that's the time, I think, for us to readjust how we want these performance measures reported through. It's a good point. You want to see that we're achieving results in the major focus that we say we are.
Yes, thank you for that, through you, Chair, for that clarification. it's very important that you do get organisational coherence. That's my plea. It saves us misusing resources, generating incoherence and so on, misunderstandings, if we can have high levels of coherence. Thanks very much.
Yes, I might just get Una Hopkins to make a comment, but I do see that we can raise it in forums to discuss in more detail later.
I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank you for raising that, and yes, you are right, and something we can look at going forward. I guess from the LTP's perspective, there's actually two elements here. One is reporting against your service delivery areas in terms of how we've grouped the activities together. Another requirement of the LTP is to measure your community outcomes. And so the community outcomes, if you go back to the vision, are those 7 goals. And we do have a requirement under the Act to report on those as well. Over the last couple of years, and with the onset of bringing in the well-beings, there has been quite a lot of work going into looking at how we measure the well-beings, how do we measure community outcomes. And so at this point in time, we only have sort of one measure really around measuring those community outcomes, while we wait for sort of the direction from central government to kind of catch up, I suppose, as to where we are with our thinking on setting those community outcomes and then how we go about measuring those. So this will be questions and debates that do come up for you to consider when we go into developing the next long-term plan.
Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just through you to Una, just another question on the same subject, because I did speak to you about it earlier, but is this, I guess, method of reporting something we also discuss with Audit New Zealand as part of their, I guess, measurement audit of our performance against long-term plans, or our development of the long-term plan?
Yes, so the performance management framework is audited by Audit New Zealand. So they go through all of our methodologies for each and every measure when we are setting them up as part of the LTP, and we are legally required to report then against them. In terms of the way we report that, there is always room to look for opportunities for improvement in that.
Thank you.
Well, we are at the non-financial performance. I wouldn't normally take this time, but given it is our first meeting, I thought it may be helpful if we just go through it page by page. So if there is any questions, elected members and board members don't miss the opportunity to talk. So if we could start off on page number 12. So these are the performance indicators that Una just went through. Actually, if we skip down to page 16, we have the arts and culture. Were there any questions on arts and culture? Community leadership on page 18. Yes, Councillor McPherson.
Yes, thank you. The levels of satisfaction of residents' confidence and engagement is with governance is modest, 30%, 31%, and other aspects have not yet been measured. So what steps are being taken to improve these ratings?
I'll just ask Una Hopkins to answer that question. Thank you, Councillor McPherson.
Sorry, Councillor, I'm just trying to find which measure you were referring to. 31% is percentage of residents who feel we are delivering and moving towards 2030 goals. Is that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so throughout that one we actually survey our residents who have had a direct transaction with the council. It's an additional question that we ask those people who have had a transactional interaction with us. And that is their perception of the elected members' progress towards those 2030 goals. It is something that is tending to track in a positive direction, and I think with the look of the new priorities and how that piece of work unfolds, we would be looking at seeing how progress towards those 2030 goals unfolds within that key piece of work there.
Mayor Chadwick.
Could I just add, overall in New Zealand, the confidence in governance is 28%. It's not good. It's really not good. So it's a big challenge for us as a council about that community engagement and confidence in our future direction. So we've got to do more together to lift that confidence. And it's, I think, when we work together that they'll see, oh God, they're all on the same boat. This is good, going in the same direction. So it is low.
Mr. Waru.
Yeah, kia ora anō tātou. I know we're going through page for page, but I have read the report already and I've sort of listed out a few questions, so do you mind if I just fire them away?
If you could hold until we go through it, just to allow all members to... We will do that in
Did you not read your report? No, okay.
We will do that in future. We just want to ensure everyone feels comfortable for the first meeting. Were there any other questions on community leadership? Planning and regulatory from page 20.
Aye.
Mr. Waru.
Ka pai. So in there's timeliness, would normally be a good performance measure. Considering the team's comments about increased complexity of applications though, affecting timeliness due to changed legislation, it seems not so much. So, but it does seem likely that this issue would be felt by other councils too, I think. Timeliness, because it's a big factor, especially when you put in for a consent and you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting. Be interesting, therefore, to know next time how our timeliness compares to other councils, maybe. I think it's a better way to measure it rather than sort of put a time limit on anything like that, because otherwise you've got nothing to compare it to. So it's just more of that. So that might mean we actually have a line in there which actually is maybe a better measure of our effectiveness around timeliness. So that might be the way to do it. This was just a suggestion, maybe.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Waru. We've invited Kurt and Jason here just to provide some comments if they wish.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. Timeliness is an interesting one because it depends how you actually measure timeliness. As you know, we're into growth, and in fact, we're actually doing pretty well considering the number of complex applications that have been lodged, and just growth brings more demand on services. Now, in regards to comparing to other councils, it depends on practices. What we do here is try to work with applicants. You can very much get that timeliness down because it's working days if things go on hold early. But what we do is we try to work with applicants. So yes, we can compare, but whether or not it gives you a good comparison, apples with apples, exactly.
And thank you for that, but something still to think about.
Thank you, Mr. Waru. Mayor Chadwick?
I think when we learn later about the Resource Management Act and planning process, you learn about we could move a lot faster as a council if we were provided with all the information up front. That's often the feedback that you get from planners, like stormwater. If only we asked for the information, if only we had it, we could have processed things faster, or geotech reports or things. But we learn that as we go through the year, really. Timeliness is only relevant. I think you be careful what you ask for there. The complexity is the issue that, we don't like seeing red, so we all dive to the red bars and think, how do we do better? And that's the way that I like to see the CE put pressure on. Are we doing all the right things at the right time against the Act? Yeah.
Councillor Kaifong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question around the noise complaints. Is there a metric as to whether or not it's the same properties that are infringing all the time? And is there an indication whether the noise complaints come from properties that are rented short-term accommodation as opposed to, longer-term residents having a party?
Morena, everyone, and through you, Madam Chair. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I guess as far as this actual indicator goes, that's all through the NRB survey side of things, and even that in itself is interesting. If you were asked as a member of the public about your satisfaction with noise control, that can also largely waver on whether you were a complainant about something next door or were the recipient of some enforcement. So there's some interesting, I guess, little tangents in that itself. But I think your question about the depth of information and I guess being able to mine down into where specific issues or repeat offenders and things are, we have that internally as council, but it doesn't really form part of that particular indicator.
Thank you, gentlemen. Were there any other questions? Councillor McPherson.
Yes, thank you. I found this part of the report very interesting indeed. It's Kurt and Jason. Kurt and Jason, thanks very much. My question doesn't really attend to the actual practicalities of this, because I recognise the challenges, particularly the shambles which we call the RMA Act. It's a bit of a mess, and I think higher levels of governance really ought to sort that out. That's a personal view. But my question, I guess, is really for the Chief Executive, overlooking all of these difficulties to do with planning and policy and consenting. Is it time for us to revise the way we do such evaluations, or is it time for us to revise the indicators that we're using, or is it time for us to revise our practices, or a combination? Your views, please.
Chief Executive.
I think the answer to that really probably lies in the priorities of council that were set in terms of the induction workshops. So you'll recall that of the two priorities, really the area of housing development is actually a leading priority at this time. At this point, what we are doing is identifying a pathway that will be presented back to council in terms of a briefing, and that will include a range of activities in partnership with central government designed to actually effectively increase the time to market of subdivisions in particular. The metrics, of course, that we're referring to today are really built out of what we set some time ago in terms of our planning documents. I think you're quite right in terms of saying, does this actually align with the priorities that have been identified and also the action plan that we're identifying in the housing area? It's a very good question to ask. At this stage, I'd have to say that it probably doesn't, because we've yet to finalise our housing strategy. And so when you look at the sort of activities that we'll be undertaking in there, we will need to actually say, how do we know we're making progress? And a review of some of these measures in the consenting area, as an example, would be a timely thing to, in my view, to consider.
Good. I appreciate that. Thanks very much. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Hurd.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My question's on page 22 around timeliness and building consents. I note that we're working to a 15-day working consent return, which is excellent, and we've got 88% average compliance with that, which is also commendable. But my question's in two parts. Does that 15 days apply to getting a consent approved, or is it answering the consent and perhaps getting a fresh set of questions? And if the latter, my second question would be, on average, how many times would we go backwards and forwards between the applicant before the consent is issued?
Yes, thank you. And in regards to question number one, that is actually 15 working days of building consent approved. Granted.
Approved?
Yes.
So 88% approved in 15 days?
Correct.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Were there any further questions in this area? No, well, I want to thank you, gentlemen, and take this opportunity to thank you and the team for all of the work that you do under such high demand and pressure. So thank you very much. No, we'll move to page 23, which is district development. Councillor Maxwell?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is this one here for the economic development and prosperity. I mean, I've always been pleased how well we're doing in this area, but I do have a question on, it says our GDP growth is up above the average of New Zealand, and we said in there we did something that the method of measuring GDP is being changed. Can I just get an explanation about what better measure that we did do?
JP, would you like to answer this question?
I think we're still working with that, and it's one of these conversations about trying to find some better measures in that discussion, and it's part of the work we're doing with RED, Rotorua Economic Development. So it is a case of working for us at this stage towards that next LTP discussion. So we've got that conversation going on as part of their longer term planning. So they're building their statement of intent for this coming year. And again, it's with us working with them on can we get something that gives us a bit more clarity and a little less it blows this way or it blows that way as far as that up or down above that average. So we're still a work in progress.
Councillor McPherson?
Thank you very much. That response alarms me a little bit because the definitions of GDP are pretty well known. They've been refined over decades, and the problem we have is that Rotorua's GDP growth was set, its target was to be above the average GDP growth in New Zealand, and the blunt result is we've not had growth above New Zealand's 2.4%, it's 2.1%, and we've failed to exceed the average GDP growth in New Zealand. So this might sound a little bit rude, but my question is quite simple. How will the appointment of an additional lead on economic development result in this target being achieved?
I'm sorry, Councillor McPherson, I ruled that out of order just because it's not to do with what's on the agenda. It is a good question, and I'll defer that on to who will be the lead in future for them to consider, but it is outside of the scope of this agenda. If JP wishes, we could get him to make some comments around your comments around GDP.
Yes, and agreeing with the councillor, there is a very clear methodology for GDP. However, it's not particularly useful when you get down below a sub-regional level because there is a fair number of assumptions that go into that methodology. So what we've been talking specifically about, and we've been doing some work with Infometrics, and is to make sure we have some very tangible and real objectives. So one of the pieces that we've been doing with Infometrics is a view of the growth within particular employment sectors within our economy. So we've got a very diverse economy locally. So one of the things that we're looking very specifically at with Rotorua Economic Development is to try and get away from what is an abstract measure when you get below the sub-regional level, to be very specific about jobs and the creation of jobs. So that's the piece we're still negotiating through that statement of intent. So I was being circumspect to say that we were working into that space. So that's obviously given you a bit more clarity. We want some real tangible targets that we can work with, across the employment growth within particular sectors, but also a growth in the overall employment figures.
Thank you for those comments, JP. And I guess, GDP doesn't measure the quality of life as well. So I'm glad that we're looking at local approaches to that as well, with targets that we can deliver on as council. Next, we have Councillor Kaifong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question around that last one, number of electronic transactions in the CBD, and the necessity to even have that as a measure, since we already have the one above. And it seems, obviously, with the cost being prohibitive, is it actually necessary given that we have another measure above? And
I think this, between Uda and I, we probably have this discussion here where one of the things that we can't actually change these measures as we've stated within the long-term plan currently. So where we are not measuring them for any particular reasons, we have to report we're not measuring them. If we were to try and change these measures now, in effect we drive ourselves into a long-term plan amendment process. So quite an onerous process. So whilst we had anticipated those electronic transactions would be a very viable and useful one, when we start looking at some of the costs of actually keeping the data sets and getting the data, it's becoming increasingly complex. So we were continuing to refine and continue to focus, but actually this becomes part of that focus of making sure we do better and get the right kind of measures in place for the next LTP. So as I say, where we've struggled with some of these, we've got to again look at is there better measures? And again, we've talked about that job creation ones. Is there a way for us to get an affordable and consistent set of data to undertake those measures? So that's part of that complexity moving forward as well. And again, the ability for us to measure either an outcome or an output of a particular activity or department area. So trying to get that clear mix as well. So that's why we've sort of caught here at the moment with what we've put forward 2 years ago.
Okay, thanks for that.
Thank you. And Mayor Chadwick, and then we'll move on.
Yes, I think it was a bit of a cheap blow to say that the lead of economic development should be responsible for GDP on a quarterly basis. It sort of lacks understanding about the report that we got back from Michelle Templer in the last quarter, so we got it, about the change in those components that roll up into GDP reporting. She gave it to us at full council, but I think the meaningful thing for us is when we are getting into creating livable communities and the goals that we've got in Vision 2050, that's when we look at what are the measures that are very important to us, not these ones here. So creating a livable community, we'll stand by what we say we'll lead on once we set that goal.
And sorry, Mr. Waddy, you had indicated you had a question.
Thank you. Tēnā tātou. Kia ora, JP. Ka pai e there, stay there. It's one question. Would there be scope to have a consistent measure of the Māori/Te Arawa economy contribution to the GDP, reported on as part of this? This is coming from my own people.
It's an incredibly interesting piece of information that would be of great value. The challenge we have at actually being able to source that kind of information. And again, I've mentioned the challenges that we have about statistics, infometrics, a whole range of other groups who provide macro information, and then it's often extrapolated down to the sub-regional level. If you were to try and get inside our district and start talking about where does the contribution of Te Arawa start and finish, it's very complex to try and identify that. You'd almost have to have, the only way we've done it before is to try and undertake a study which gave us a snapshot of the largest Te Arawa trusts and their economic activity around them. But within that, it's very, very difficult to see where that goes into other company holdings or property ownerships. So at this stage, there is no way we could do that without extensive amount of work. And I would also make the comment that we would probably still not capture it all.
So the answer was, yes, it can be done.
I think that's a very good suggestion and challenge that we're going to have to put a lot of thought into, because it would have a big impact.
And actually, you know, yes, I've got my Te Tataua Te Arawa hat on, but this would actually be a first. I've been doing a bit of study around the place. It'll actually be a first for any rohe, I Rotorua o Aotearoa ne. And also it'll be a good indicator for the council, not just Te Arawa, but for the council too. So you've always got that information there. So it's not impossible, it's hard, but it's not impossible, JP. Kia ora.
I think as you said, we could get a high proportion of it, and there's a couple of consultancies that do a lot of the accounting services for the Te Arawa Trust. So there is a potential that we could gather it, and that's what's been done in the past, is talk to those particular Deloitte's, GHA, EY. There was a number of them that actually came together to actually give us what they saw as a summary, but it was about an 80% picture.
Thank you. I might just get the Chief Executive to make a comment on this.
Kia kaha, Jeff.
Kia ora koutou. Look, one of the things that's occurring to me is that there is a level of frustration around this measurement framework. And this is a formal measurement framework that has to meet the test of Audit New Zealand to ensure that it is reliable. And I underline the point about reliability. There is a question about validity. And the question is, what are these metrics actually measuring? And are they accurate enough to discern differences or being able to actually make conclusions about strategy, success, or whatever? Now, I think where we are at the moment is our measures are our measures, and we'll continually try and improve them. But what I would strongly suggest is that a lot of the questions that you're talking about, there's opportunities as we move through the operations report into various areas to be asking questions about, is the strategy, whether it's an aquatic strategy, let's say, is this strategy working, and how do we know? And what are the sort of things that staff you are looking at, you are researching, or you're able to report to us on, which actually gives us confidence as to the work that we've commissioned is actually producing the results we expected. Now, that's a conversation that's occurring outside of this formal set of metrics. I think trying to drive all of our expectations about performance reporting into this metrics report is going to be fraught, because we're never going to probably quite get there to a point that you're going to express continued frustration that the metric we agreed 2 years ago isn't actually quite what we thought it was actually reporting on, but we still have to report on it because that's what we said we would do. You know, what I can hear behind your questions is a desire to have a more dynamic performance reporting system that actually reflects to you almost a dashboard of performance of this organisation. And I think trying to actually see this set of metrics is probably going to fall a little short of your expectations. That said, though, I'd go back to my subsequent comment was that there is no reason, however, that as we are looking to report around our O&M reports, that we should be having discussion, you should be asking questions about what are the metrics that our different divisions are using to evaluate performance. Now, JP has just sort of opened the doorway a smidgen, if you like, to the discussion around how do we know our economy is moving forward and is going to continue to move forward. Now, that's a bigger discussion, I think, than what we can have around this metric, but would be a very worthwhile discussion to actually ask and to have within the topic when JP or Michelle Templar is reporting with respect to the CCO results. That's the sort of dialogue I think that you would find valuable.
Thank you, Jeff. Mayor Chadwick?
I think you're onto something there, because Rotorua does things differently. And with Te Tato or Te Arawa, I hear the aspiration for a Te Arawa plan. And we never talk about the iwi economy and its value to us as a district, because we don't measure it. And it never comes through to us here except in strategic forums that we attend about the value. And the questions are we increasing that value for our people in our district? So it would be a fantastic thing if you could develop cultural economic indicators that are meaningful, that feed into our review of something as boring as GDP, and make it real for us.
It would certainly spice things up. Yeah. However, I think we look at it as I know it's challenging. I'm not naive as to think that it's just like Pantene and happens overnight. But I think what we could look at it as an opportunity. Let's look at it as an opportunity rather than a challenge. Something for food for thought. Kia ora.
Thank you. We'll move on to sports, recreation and environment, which is on page 25. Were there any questions on this? Oh yes, Mayor Chadwick.
It's not a question, it's a comment. Over summer, all of us as councillors and community board members in Te Tato must have had feedback, and the feedback that I've received is how beautiful Rotorua is, how clean it is, and the streets, and even all of the ratepayer meetings out at the lakes. Thanks for the clearing of the transfer stations when we've called. I've had phenomenal feedback about what a beautiful district that we live in. So I think that's good for council officers to hear. So it's not a question.
Yes, it wasn't, but thank you for your comments, Mayor Chadwick. We'll move on to roads and footpaths, page 27. Yes, Councillor Maxwell. Hey, Trevor, put your mic on.
Aroha mai. On page 26, I was just going to comment about the aquatic centre doing so well, and it indicates if we keep this up, it'll be the highest participation growth in the calendar year. So looking forward to our centre doing well, continue doing well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Maxwell. Councillor McPherson.
Thank you. On the same topic, I note that customer satisfaction was not measured with regard to the aquatic centre, and it was the subject. It was over the last year given outsourced management, and I guess my question is, how will we know the extent to which that outsourcing has been successful?
Thank you, Councillor McPherson. We do go into more detail in the next report, but we'll invite Rob Keithley, who's the Manager of Sports and Recreation, to make some comments to your question.
Morena koutou, thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. The measurements on satisfaction have been carried out through the NRB process, which is a phone survey of residents. And because we've used that in the past, that hasn't happened yet this year. The aquatic centre itself has been doing some measures of people attending the pool, which is a slightly different sampling frame from just people picking up the phone at the end of a phone call. So the suggestions we've got from the people attending the pool is that satisfaction's been good, but we need to compare it properly with the measures that we have from the previous surveys. So we're waiting on that phone survey to be completed.
Thank you, Rob. Were there any further questions for sports and recreation? No, we'll move on to roads and footpaths, page 27. Thank you, Rob. Any questions on roads and footpaths? There appear to be none. Sewage, page 29. Stormwater and land drainage. Waste management. Now, I believe Councillor Kaifong had a question here.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That was just my question, just in relation to the budget considerations and what we could do to mitigate that budget consideration where we have excess cost for waste collection. And I think you mentioned it was because of what was going into wheelie bins.
Through you, Madam Chair, I think the estimating the actual volumes of waste to generate per household to go to the landfill is always going to be a hard task. And Councillor Kaifong, you asked earlier the question, are we doing some studies about it? And we are working with Ministry for the Environment at the moment to get some funding to do some assessment. But in broad terms, if you take the average waste to generate every year for landfilling, it's about 12 to 13,000 tons a year. About 40% of that comprises of petrusiples, that's organic material. We estimate about 20, half of that is green waste that goes to the landfill. So that translates about 3,000 tons of green waste getting to the landfill that could have been separated by the individual people, residences. The difficulty, of course, we've got is that the economics at this point in time, they don't appear to support a separate green waste collection system. We have an estimate which says that to supply bins and do a collection on a weekly or fortnightly basis is going to cost somewhere in the region of $1.5 to $2 million a year. And yet, if we avoid all green waste going to the landfill, saves us about $500,000 to $600,000 of landfilling materials. However, there are opportunities for people to do more composting, and also opportunities partnering with some other providers, to provide that kind of service. I know personally, I've got a green waste, collection outside the council, but it costs me almost $250 a year compared to $200 for our comprehensive waste management. So we need to find the golden spot between what's economically affordable, what makes business sense, and what is a balanced cases. But we are working on it, and hopefully the study will give us some indications.
Thank you, Stavros. Councillor Kaifong, did you have a further question?
Just that perhaps this is an opportunity for us to raise GDP, Councillor McPherson, by diverting food waste and green waste and looking at a business opportunity for the council.
Yes, and I'm sure when Rotorua Economic Development do their CCO report, there is some really interesting work behind the scenes about creating a circular economy and food waste as well. Mayor Chadwick.
That's the issue for us about sustainability. We had those same arguments about a recycling centre, a recycling service, and everybody said it wasn't affordable. But actually, we ought to be looking after our environment, and so it should be seen as an investment in our environment. And that's just a different way we'll frame it. It's not at this quarterly, not at this reporting, but we had those arguments. Can't afford a recycling service, can't afford it. Now we're saying exactly the same about green waste, and I think it's bad that we're putting it in the red bins and pretending when we shut the lid that we haven't done that. We should be avoiding waste to landfill, and we should be doing the right thing with that. So it's another argument, I think, when we get to the annual plan.
Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I put my hand up. I put wood waste when the wind blows a branch off my fig tree, in the bin it goes, because, I think you've got to look at sustainability in the bigger picture. And Stavros, I'm not sure when we confront all this, but it's a whole lot of people driving their cars out to the landfill, to the green waste recycling, or is it better that it's collected at the gate? And if we're getting too much in the red bins, are they too big? All of that stuff. So when do we confront all that? And what are the fine-tuning aspects, I guess, of what I think overall has been highly successful advance, actually, in our waste recovery from the community. Also, there's the issue of a whole lot of green waste lying around not collected. That potentially presents a fire risk in extreme dry conditions. So, there's all those things that need to be considered.
Yes, I believe that discussion can come into our long-term plan as well, where we look at, do we need to do things differently, not only in the short term, but the long term as well. So we're sort of swaying away from questions. So if there's no other questions, we'll move on to the next section. Oh, sorry, Mr. Waru.
Yes, Pātai, very easy Pātai, through you, Madam Chair. And it's as simple as this. There seems to be a lot of red in the waste management part of the report. Should we be concerned? I'm not too sure I'm aiming this. Stavros?
Stavros, would you like to make any comments? I think that the report does say for itself. You have made some comments, but if there's anything else you would like to add?
Madam Chair, I think that the rate relates to actually sort of very somewhat targeted recovery, especially timber and concrete and other kind of products. Just to some degree, we go through historical records, and to some degree, those materials heavily depend on the type of building activity and economic activity that takes place. I don't think we can always be accurate in our predictions, but I think we have appropriate facilities and opportunities for people to recover. Whether they're going to meet this target exactly on, it's something that we need to continue to strive to do that, but they will be there. I don't think we'll be far off from the targets, but obviously with the way we report it, they appear to be red because they're not bang on.
Kia ora.
Thank you. We'll move to page 36, water supplies. There appear to be no questions. Excellent. Well, that comes to the conclusion of that section of the report. So we'll now move on to recommendation 3, which is on page 40, operational report July to December 2019. So I'll call for a mover and a seconder. Moved by Mayor Chadwick, seconded by Mr. Waru, that the operational report for July to December 2019 be received. I put that motion to the vote. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. So we'll start off with the operations group. So if I could invite JP. We'll take, sorry JP, stay there. We'll take the report as read and we'll go through the operations, and if there's any questions that you have, then I'll just ask the managers and they can just answer the question from their seat if they wish, depending how many questions there are. So the operations group, which starts on page 41, were there any questions around there? Mr. Waru.
Kia ora, nui aku pātai. First meeting of the year, got to get it out. So when it comes to reporting, this is this feedback from our Te Tatau o Te Arawa Ropu. I'm not sure how it happens, but it would be useful information to know what percentage of the consent applications are for Māori land and what percent of building consents relate to marae. Now, I know they can't give full details, but it would be nice if we could sort of find a way to know that. Kia ora. Is there a way to do that?
Thank you, Mr. Waru. That is a detailed question, so I won't put our staff on the spot for that, but I would ask that they come back to you with that information.
Okay. Kia ora.
Yes, Mrs. Bray.
Council Safe City Guardians. I was at the Japanese festival on the weekend and it was extremely hot and the Guardians didn't have any hats on. Have they got, do they have that as part of their uniform for health and safety?
It's a very kind question to ask. I'll ask our Chief Executive to respond.
My understanding is that they are actually furnished with a range of equipment which does include sun, hats and water and so forth. So obviously it was the individual guardian's decision that day not to wear the full attire.
That's interesting because he did say we need some hats, so no.
No, interesting feedback, thank you. Councillor Yates?
Tēnā koe. So my question is around the inner city guardians and whether or not they might be able to be used as part of our educational, if we're looking at the street movement and the parking and what have you, and if they could potentially be used to help in part of that education and informing, because often they're seen as being enforcers, which I would like, I'd like to see them, because we've had the question also raised about where our Māori wardens, and they used to be great in that. So I think they could be part and parcel of the education that happens and communication that happens on our streets.
Yes, it's a very good question, and thank you for raising the role of the Māori wardens as well. Mayor Chadwick?
I've seen the enforcement officers stop and help people with how to use the meters, and I've said to them, thank you for doing that. So I think they're doing that like all of us when you see anyone struggle. But the education is a good idea.
Councillor Kaifong?
I'm not sure if this is the right place to ask the question, but with the inner city CBD safety patrols, which were increased over summer, when will that be reviewed as to whether or not that needs to continue longer than presumably the end of February?
We're at the moment going through exactly that process, but it's really not so much whether or not it could be discontinued, but what do we need to do for the longer term. At this particular time, whilst there was I think it was a good summer period, there was nevertheless an intense presence in the city, and what we are seeing and hearing is there doesn't seem to be a lessening of the desire of people in the city to actually see that service scale back. So it's unlikely, I think, that it would be so. That said, it's important to review how we're actually carrying that function out at the moment, and that's exactly what we're doing at the moment.
Thank you. Were there any other questions for the operations group? Okay, we'll move on. I'll invite Gina Rangi actually you can join either from there or up here, to just review your report for the Mana Hautu Māori. So this is on page 56. But I do acknowledge a lot of the work that you and your team does kind of extends throughout all of these reports. But thank you. Mana Hautu Māori.
Tēnā tātou a kurangatira, tēnei te mihi kia koutou. Actually, usually when Monty was here, I used to present with Monty, so I might invite my colleague Arapeta to join me as well. So for those who, and I know elected members will be familiar with this, we've talked about this through induction, my role focuses primarily on our capability within council to engage effectively with Māori, and Arapeta's role focuses primarily on our external relationships. So we work really closely together across a range of kaupapa, and we have working alongside us a team that provides specialised advice across all of council. So much of our work is dealt with in the reports of my colleagues and the other group managers, but there are some specific things that we're working on at the moment that we wanted to highlight. The first one is Ohinemutu Village, and so councillors may remember that when we began the process of redeveloping the Lakefront Reserve, one of the questions that was raised was we will be delivering or creating a space where there will be increased visitors to the reserve. Many of those visitors will walk through to Ohinemutu, crossing the marae, and it is one of the iconic images, truly iconic in the actual meaning of that word, of Rotorua. And so they will be walking across the village, looking at people's homes. And the question that was raised was, to what extent will the council infrastructure within the village meet the standards that we will be applying within the reserve? And what image are we presenting to tourists on arrival? That, of course, is a question when you're dealing with, private homes and people live in the village. It really is a question of asking the residents, what is it that you want to see? And that's a broader conversation around internally around their own aspirations for their own properties, including marae. So there are a number of marae within the village. So some things council can influence and some things council cannot, and it made sense for us to support Ohinemutu residents to, create a vision of what they wanted the village to look like. So they selected ISMIS, who are also the designers working in the Lakefront Reserve. They did a full tender process. We had an outstanding number of recipients, higher than some of the tender respondents that would engage on a council project, and that really reflected that nationally firms were really excited with the opportunity to work with such an important place. So last year the ISMIS were selected. They carried out a range of workshops with residents in the village, and they've provided a draft plan. So at the moment, council provides a small amount of funding to support that process, but it has very much been the leadership of a group elected by the village themselves. So at the moment, they're meeting with every single resident, so they're door knocking and seeking advice from the residents within the village around what is it that they want to see. At some stage, that will be reported back to council to think about what part do we play in that vision. It's a long-term vision. Obviously some of the aspirations in there will be for the village to lead, but there may well be a contribution that we make. So, for example, what does the paving look like in the village? What does lighting look like? Are the geothermal hotspots safe for tourists to manoeuvre around? All of those kinds of visual and safety issues that we ordinarily deal with as council. So I just wanted to flag that as an important project because that will be coming back at some stage over the next probably 6 months, depending on how long it takes for the residents themselves to determine their plan or their vision. There are a couple of other kaupapa that we've been working on extensively. One is wastewater schemes. As you know, we're in construction on Rotorua Te Rotomā, including building the pipework network, which involves a large number of Māori land blocks. So we're working to work out how we work with those Māori landowners to inform and seek consent for that project. We're also working with the Tarawera community around the options for dealing with wastewater in the Tarawera community. We received back the cultural impact report just before Christmas. Some of the recommendations in there were to meet with Māori landowners and the iwi authorities to discuss the impact on them, their aspirations around water quality and their aspirations around papakainga development as well. So we've done that and are still in the process of working through concerns that they have. Do you want to talk to housing?
Kia ora koutou, kai aku rangatira, tēnei rā te mihi ake kia koutou. I rungi ngā huatanga o te wā. So Jean has explained my role, having that more external focus. So the topics that he's spoken about, I have had some involvement, but in particular, I want to speak about the housing strategy and Te Arawa's involvement in that. So over the last 3 or 4 months, we've been doing quite a bit of work in terms of engaging with Te Arawa entities to understand their aspirations and barriers to unlocking housing from a Te Arawa perspective. Alongside that, we've been doing some work in analysing the data around Māori land development and papakainga development, and also models, trying to understand some models for unlocking papakainga development. The reason papakainga, Māori land and Te Arawa are so critical to the housing strategy is at a high level, 25% of the land in the Rotorua district is Māori land. If we don't work out how to develop that land from a housing perspective, we're automatically constrained in terms of the growth of the district. So that's the first point. The second point that I think is really important to highlight is that one of the challenges that we face in terms of housing is creating affordable housing. And within papakainga, there is significant potential to reduce the cost of housing because the land value aspect of it can be taken out of it. So if Māori whānau are moving on to their own land, not having to purchase the land, automatically we can reduce that cost of development. So those are kind of the two key points at this stage why Te Arawa are quite critical in this housing strategy and unlocking the critical challenges that we're facing. Kia ora.
Thank you, Gina Narapito. Were there any questions? Councillor McPherson.
Thank you very much for the reports. I'm particularly interested in the extent to which Te Arawa can assist with the development of a housing strategy. The two snippets, the two key pieces of information you've given us are vital to understanding the potential, but I wondered to what extent the plans we heard from some time ago to build quite a large number of papakainga homes is actually in the process of being moved ahead. Are you able to report progress? Thank you.
Yeah, not in any great detail other than to say that we appreciate that exact problem. The aspiration has been there for some time, but we haven't seen that eventuate to actual houses and papakainga being developed. So in this data analysis and this initial research, we're trying to understand why is it that hasn't moved. And we already do have some high-level understanding of where those barriers are, but it's too early to give you a definitive answer on how the final strategy addresses those barriers.
Kia ora.
Mayor Chadwick.
The work you're doing, and down at Ohanimutu Village, have we got regional council involved at this stage? Because every year back through from even our days of the Te Arawa Advisory Committee, Ruapeka and digging, you know, bulldozers going in to dig a trench and things were pretty crude. But actual land management of their land and the stream and their water frontage is going to be quite complex.
That's right, and so a number of the aspirations that have been discussed by the village are not necessarily district council issues, and so the regional council have been involved in a number of the meetings, including looking at solutions for the Ruapeka. There are some environmental constraints about what they can do, but they've been very involved with the community discussing what the options are.
Thank you, Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, Gina, I'm not sure if you were going to speak about the Rotorua issue that is on the report, but I get daily, if not weekly, if not daily feedback regarding this issue, and you know, I know the local forest user community, or in the wider sense, are very respectful of the status of Lake Rotorua, and would like to be ambassadors in, I guess, engendering that continued respect. But there are also concerns about the impact on events and access to trails that people have, I guess, used, with the understanding that these trails have been put in place with the full knowledge and consultation of the landowners. So I know that there is some access that's gone in the form of taping that's regularly being flouted, and that doesn't help get to a resolution. So is there an update on how we're working together, I guess, to get a resolution to this issue that our community can get behind and support? Just be interested in that.
I think, and that is very much the issue, is that council manages the recreation access, but we are not the landowner. The landowner is CNI, who engage with particular mana whenua groups, which is a separate entity from the neighbouring landowner, the Rotorua Board of Control. And so, to the extent we can, I think council are in a very important position because we're able to engage with and I think hopefully influence all of the groups that are affected, including users in the forest. There have been some temporary fixes, as you've said, over the holiday, and we are looking for more permanent solutions that will require us to work with and get agreement from particularly the landowner and hopefully also with the Board of Control as well. So we're in direct discussions with both around that. Can I also say that in respect of the event organisers, I know that Rob Keithley's team last year started talking to a number of the major event organisers and asking them to change their routes. They've been very responsive and very positive about doing that because they see the importance. There's been a growing recognition, I guess, amongst the event organiser community that they're often working on Māori land and they need to support effective relationships, so they've been very good at responding.
Thank you, Gina. Next we have Mr. Waru, followed by Councillor Maxwell.
Kia ora rai te chairman. Tēnā kōrua. Mihi ana kia kōrua I tā kōrua kaha ki te whakaimi mihari ngā kōrero nei. So thank you very much. Awesome report, and he rawa te whakaronga atu ki ngā kōrua pāna ki taku haukai. Kia o hene mutu. That one is in particular interest to me because wena taku pā. I wera ai oku ringa, I reire, I kiri pāpaka ai oku waiwa I reire. So that's I was born and bred o hene mutu, and I was just wondering, I'm very excited about the project, and I was wondering, and this is coming from a few of my kuruakui aunties, uncles that all still reside there. In terms of timelines, are we on track?
What I can say is it's not really for council to set the timeline in terms of we will give enough time for Ohinemutu residents to develop their own aspirations. In terms of the interface and the connection points between the Lakefront Reserve and Ohinemutu, we would like to start those conversations over the next 6 months. But we have deliberately scheduled the Lakefront Reserve project to keep that at the end of the process, to give more time for Ohinemutu to clarify what the people's vision is for for the village. Although technically they're separate areas, clearly you've got visitors wandering from the reserve across into the village, and so that's why that interface is really important, that we get that right and that meets the expectations of the residents. And that's important from a visual legibility or a visual consistency perspective, but it's also important in terms of the fact that when people walk up, to the marae, they then cross over what is not public land. And so having clarity around where people can and can't go, what is public space and what is not, and how to be respectful, those are all urban design questions that need to be taken into account by council as we develop the reserve. So in terms of timeframes, as much as possible, we're trying to give Ohinemutu the time that it needs to develop its own vision, and we will respond to that.
Ka pai. And just from a Ohinemutu person's mentality, I suppose, katoa te rawahi e whenua Māori. There is no public, but we welcome everyone in as long as they're respectful of our wahi and our homes. That's the way it's always been.
And can I just say that has been an enduring principle that has been stated at every meeting. The importance that councils work within the village must uphold a standard of manaakitanga, which has two expressions. One, that it's attractive to visitors, but also that visitors are protected, so they're not wandering into geothermal hotspots and such.
That's a really good point. Councillor Maxwell, followed by Councillor Yates.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ngā mihi o te tauhau ki a kōrua. Kia ora. As somebody who moved from the mighty Awaho and lifted the IQ in Ohinemutu, I was very pleased with the progress that you've been to make in that there. And there's somebody who happily lives there, and I do meet a lot of tourists. I think we need some bigger no exit signs, because often it's going out and say, hey, that's no exit, you're going to go to the end of the road. Oh, but it gives me a chance to practice my languages with them wherever they're from. And so I'm pleased. I think probably, and then every now and again, the odd person is on the committee down there. I say, when's council going to get us together? And I thought, hang on. And as you said, you're waiting for them. So maybe as a councillor, I'm going to motivate and start moving some of them along. Can I ask about, it's near, we did talk about the question is around the entranceway, but at the moment I know that the sound shelter is being held up, and is that still holding up the entranceway? Is it still a lot of asbestos problems around there or something?
I'm just looking over at JP. I think it might be a question for him.
Through you, Madam Chair. I was just looking around for Rob Keithley, who's just managing the process around the removal of the sound shell. So yes, we continue to have significant challenges with the removal of the sound shell building. We've been using words like there was a unique application of asbestos inside that building, which has created a significant hazard in its removal. So it is proceeding quite slowly. We actually have to source and have sourced a team of personnel to work in that space, or contractors to work in that space, who again have the skills and certainly the health and safety practice to remove, as I say, what is a unique problem within the asbestos. Now, as Gina has said, we're not tying the two pieces together, so we have a view that that building is to be removed, and once it's removed, we will reinstate simply with some temporary car parking until we are at a point where we can conclude the design and that interface discussion with the village. So again, we were doing nothing more than removing and partially reinstating to ensure we can provide adequate car parking to support the current operators on the lakefront. and at that point wait until the other work has been completed before we finalise any finishing designs for that western end. Again, I would say that there is a unique set of challenges within that building. So Rob or Henry may have repeated this previously, but I'll say it again. One of the challenges we've got is as sections are removed, there actually has to be almost a wiping down of almost every surface around an area where a piece of asbestos has been removed. Because of the terrible way it was applied, it then has to be tested, because if any dust has moved from one location to another, we're back into a contaminated environment. So therefore it must be again washed down, retested, and the next section removed. Now, we're also extended into the way it was applied being so, I'll repeat again, unique. It's actually created a contamination underneath the building as well. So we're actually seeking, we have to seek an additional resource consent to remove the layer of soil underneath the building as well. So we're currently going through a consenting process for that. So we're hoping that that will align with the removal of the building, at which point we will then have to remove a layer of soil from underneath the building, and that's part of our reinstatement, that we'll have to put some fresh topsoil back into that as we put it into a temporary car parking space. So, Your Worship, you're right. I think people haven't quite understood the complexity of removing what should be a simple building. It is just because of the way that the asbestos was, in effect, sprayed around the entire interior of the building lining, and it's just created such a hazardous space for its removal.
Thank you, JP. And just a reminder to direct questions through the chair. It's not appropriate to go across the table. Councillor Yates.
Tēnā koe, Madam Chair. O tira tēnā kōrua. Well, yes, I hail from the mighty Kotu, which is just over the stream from Mohenimatu. But on that note, we're all one whānau. So, well, actually, I'm probably Upper Kotu. Anyway, couple of questions around the Ohenimatu development and with regards to council assets specifically. So roading and lighting down there in particular has been raised with me, and whether or not there could be some immediate steps whilst there's progress going on behind the scenes. Is there any opportunity for that also to be looked into? And another one that was brought up was around, so two parts to this, was around the actual council. There are some council reserve land down there, and whether or not that could be utilised for sports and recreation, or whether or not that's actually part of the redevelopment. They were council specific questions, so kia ora.
So the process is that for the village to agree on what their priorities are, and there's no limit on what they might express as their priorities. Although we're supporting the process of funding, the residents are fully entitled to include aspirations around council and regional council and other entities, as well as their own properties. In terms of the council-specific work streams, we haven't yet had a direction from the village on what the agreed priorities are. I would anticipate that those kinds of issues will no doubt be raised within the vision, but we're waiting to receive that back from the village.
Yes. Mr. Waru, and then we'll move on.
Ka pai, kia ora, through you, Madam Chair. What was it about the incentives? That's what I want to talk about around the housing. So you mentioned, and this might apply to probably all potential developers. Are there any thoughts around providing some kind of incentive for potential developers, i.e. Te Arawa or others, to follow that kind of kaupapa? Because I know that's not always what we want to do with our lands. And I know there's some of the lands and trusts representative on Te Tatau, so it's not always the way we want to do things. So Throw that in your court te arapeta.
Kia ora Rawiri. Yeah, good question. We have identified as part of the process the need to look at the policy and planning levers that we have as council to see how we can shift those to provide that incentive. So that is part of the process. Beyond that too, there's part of the process needs to look at how do you fund the development of these papakainga that creates an investment opportunity for Rotorua as well. So I think there's working that out potentially as an incentive for entities that don't necessarily want to do a papakainga development, but they are willing to put their money into it from an investment perspective and get a return out of that. So that's the quick answer. It's still too early really to give you some specifics on what those incentives might look like, but we are considering it as part of that process.
Thank you. I believe that was all of the questions. Excellent. Kia ora kōrua. The next group is the strategy group. So I'd like to invite JP Gaston up, which is on page 57. Thank you, JP. I'll just ask you to give a brief overview of the report, but we'll take it as read.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Probably the one thing I would add is we had a note in there about just giving an update on the 2-year program. So 2 appointments have been made, and so some of you will know and some will not know the 2-year program came originally from the Mayoral Task Force for Jobs, so some time ago, but it has been put in place as an independent trust for some time. So we support that, as do approximately 30 other councils. So the contributions that usually come from councils in this regard is that the mayors set aside some of their time to provide some mentoring to the participants within the 2-year program. And we also provide some transport costs for those who are involved in the program to go to the various wānanga around the country. So at this stage we'll be sending those 2 participants to meetings in, I think, Wellington and Christchurch. So it's simply airfares. The other 3 wānanga they'll be attending via cars, so they're within driving distance, so one in Hamilton and Auckland, as well as the one in Rotorua, obviously. So short amount of distance costs, so we've got our usual cost estimates of approximately $3,000 to support that program, as well as Her Worship's time in providing that mentorship. The participants in the 2-year program also commit to doing 2 local community projects. So they set aside 100 hours of their own time to undertake a community project, which is almost that community payback for the development that they're receiving. So that's kind of the process. I know Her Worship and I believe Councillor Tapsell was involved in the interview process and the appointment of the 2 successful participants this year, and I understand there was 5 who were interviewed, so really high calibre applicants from which those 2 were selected. So that's an update in that space. The one other piece, and I'll just carry on from Arapeta's comment, was one of the other issues we've talked about, and Stavros and I have been talking significantly about the stormwater infrastructure, which is seen as one of the main barriers to development across the catchment as we move up the Caldera Rim. So we've met over the last week or so with the 6 owners or owner representatives of the areas that are currently zoned or being zoned as part of the special plan change process. So Pukahangi on the west side and those owners on the east side as well, to talk about taking a more proactive and design approach to solutions which are outside the normal property boundaries of where they have to try and build these solutions currently, and to taking more of a catchment-wide approach. So really looking at us doing the lead designing of a solution that goes beyond the individual landowner space. So we'll be looking to report back to you on what that might mean. But at this stage, we received some very positive support from those 6 landowners, developers in that space. So that's a meeting that's running parallel to the other work we're undertaking in discussions around developing the housing strategy. So happy to answer off any other questions on my section.
Thank you, JP. Councillor Donaldson?
Thank you, Chair. Through you, JP, just a question around the key projects. So those two economic projects that you've highlighted there, Lakefront and Whakarewarewa Tokarangi Forest. Good to see that officers are having those confidential commercial discussions and without reopening the conversation about the validity of GDP as an economic indicator. I'm personally more interested in business confidence. So I have had some approaches regarding the issue of concessions in the forest, and also approaches from interested business people seeking to tap into these developments. And so I just wonder if you can enlarge a bit about where those inquiries should be directed. I understand, I completely accept that they should be commercial discussions, not in the political arena. Where should anyone who's looking to seek an opportunity be directed in the first place? Thank you.
Madam Chair, we've offered to provide that sort of link service for CNI Iwi Holdings Limited. So if they came directly to us, we would make those introductions and set up the appropriate time. Obviously, CNI Iwi Holdings is quite a massive business, and we're but one small corner of it, but they're very keen on supporting the development inquiries around the forest. So through to us, and we can then pass those directly on and manage them through for anyone who's interested.
And the same for the lakefront, I take it?
Yes, that's correct. So, Councillor, just elaborating further, as you were aware, late last year we put out a invitation to pitch. So this is for the commercial footprint that exists on the lakefront. Through that, we've identified a potential lead investor. So we're not in a position really to disclose that any further, as they're still looking at whether they can bring any additional partners. But part of that process was also to gather interest from groups who might want to be tenants or to operate businesses from a new commercial building to be built on the lakefront. We've been working and using Colliers to just to determine the validity of those applicants, and in a way present them as here's a curated list of potential businesses that could go into development to those investors. So we're still working in that commercial space to develop up that proposal in more detail. So if there is any other inquiries still to come into us directly would be helpful, at which point we can put that into that mix.
Mayor Chadwick?
A question and also a statement. Thank you about announcing the Tuia reps. If I could just announce their names, because it was a very good process. Supported by staff, call for applications, CVs and applications formally done, interviews led by Councillor Tapsell, and I endorsed the two applicants, Janty Walker and Stephanie George. Very excited about the role, and we'll connect them into programs and initiatives. So any councillor that knows of anything going in your patch that they would like to be exposed to, that's what they're trying to learn about the depth and the scope of council business and community business. And also the launch of the 88.3 power radio station at the Youth Centre Trust as a means of connecting with youth voices. And I think that's going to be very important when we go forward with our strategies. How do we get input into our livable communities? And that's a great mechanism for us, other than other radio stations also around. But that was a product as a result of the youth strategy, Pūtaki Nui. So it's great to see some product or some outcomes happening as a result of a youth strategy supported by other sponsors in the town as well.
Thank you. Councillor Bentley.
Thank you, Chairperson. with regard to the discussions you're holding with developers on the rim of the caldera, as you call it, JP, are we still in conversation with the developer that has the land on Otonga Malfoy?
Yes, we are. That's pretty much been led through the consenting department at this stage, and so Jason Ward has been leading those conversations and with heavy involvement from the infrastructure team. So, as I say, that's linking into our existing infrastructure, particularly stormwater within the CBD.
Councillor Maxwell, followed by Councillor Kaifo.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. My actually two quick questions on the 2019 election engagement plan. But before asking those questions, I do want to commend and congratulate Una and her department for the amount, as we can see in the report here, the amount of work they put in and the collateral that can be used again. But the questions I've got was, what was the percentage turnout for Rotorua, and is the cost worthwhile doing again because of it being so low?
We'll ask Una to respond to that. Thank you, Councillor Maxwell.
I'm just, through you, Madam Chair, just looking over to Rick to make sure I get the percentage turnout right. It was 45%?
No, 42, was it? 42.5? Pardon? 45.
45, yes. Yep. So we were, Rick and I have this kind of ongoing debate every 3 years. We would love, and we set ourselves a personal little target of 50%, but it is a really hard task to get people motivated out to vote. Compared to, you know, your national elections, where I think the turnout there is in the high 70s to 80% type thing. In terms of the cost, I don't feel that I'm actually in a position to be able to answer that. I'll leave that up to yourselves, I think, to formulate your own opinions there.
Congratulations and a job well done by your department. Kia ora.
Thank you. Councillor Kaifong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just JP, a question around the housing strategy. MHUD still have to do their formal assessment, so what's the timeline for that, and then the timeline for us to get into the finalisation of our strategy?
Through you, Worship. Good questions. Ministry of Housing and Urban Development have undertaken their place-based assessment, and it's been circulated to us as draft, so that they had a number of gaps they were still looking to address, which we were hoping to see resolved in the next few weeks. So, but at this stage, their focus has been quite clear on identifying what they saw as the core problems. So even though they're looking to finalise the report with some additional information, we've been working on the basis that they've confirmed some of the problems that we've seen here locally, and we've received back as feedback from developers, but also from the significant amount of stakeholder meetings we held late last year. So there is some synchronicity in those views of those challenges across all aspects of the housing continuum. We're working with our establishment leadership group, so Ministry of Housing and Development were quite clear that we needed to make sure in developing our local strategy that there was a very clear partnership with Te Arawa, and we were quite comfortable saying without reservation that's how things are done in Rotorua. So that establishment leadership group is giving us that starting point. So we're producing a number of background papers for them, and for us that gets us to a point of being in a position where we have a strategy framework within the next few weeks. So that's really our basis then to be able to talk more widely with the community. We've also been clear in working with those various government agencies who are also aware of the challenges to identify, so what are the key projects that we need to go forward with immediately, and as you've heard from Arapeta and even my comments, Some of that is directly related to activities council should be doing anyway, and so we're proceeding with those, but we're also developing up with those other government agencies some other additional options that could be immediately started. So two-pronged, what needs to be addressed immediately to start looking at some of those problems that we're aware of, and then with the production of a draft strategy in the next few weeks, a view of how we're engaging more widely across the community to really set that overall aspiration and direction. So next few weeks is the short answer.
Thank you. And the final question to Mr. Waru.
Kia ora, just following up on the kōrero around the engagement plan through Madam Chair. In terms of the data you have, are you able to extrapolate what for instance, what was the stats for the under 25-year-olds, the stats for Māori? Is there a way to get that data?
Through you, Madam Chair, yes, there is.
I take it means looking over to Rick.
Yes, I'm just looking over to our electoral deputy officer. The question's probably best answered for him as to the detail of how we're able to get that information. So, Rick, if you could just respond to that one, please.
Yes, and through you, Madam Chair, certainly Department of Internal Affairs does a significant breakdown of statistics like that. It's available online, but I can certainly get that to members.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's all the questions. So we'll conclude the strategy group report. Thank you, JP. My suggestion now is that we break for lunch and then we return with the remaining two groups and then go into confidential section. Does that sound like a good idea? Good. I'm getting nods. Okay. We'll resume the meeting for now and we'll have lunch for half an hour and return at 1 o'clock. Thank you. To page 61 in our agenda, which is Infrastructure Group Report, and we have Stavros Michael here to overview the report. Thank you, Stavros.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will take the report as read. I've got a couple of comments to make, I think, in the interest of new councillors, I suppose, the new elected members too. Briefly, what you see in front of you, it's basically a snapshot of all the works we do in our annual business plan. Your infrastructure, your core statutory infrastructure, has got a replacement value of about $1.2 billion. That's your waters, the three waters, your transportation, waste, services, and so on. The general approach to that, we renew a small portion of it every year, about 1.5% of it, 1.5%, and we maintain the balance of 98.5% of the networks, through an appropriate funding. The combined renewals and operational maintenance and repairs of the networks is about $37 million a year for all infrastructure. And our primary objectives here is to maintain a stable infrastructure. That means we do not have sudden and shock events that disrupt service. A reliable service means that every time you want to use a bathroom or have a shower or drink some water or go onto the road, you have a high level of confidence that you will get the service, and safe. Safe for the people who are using the service, safe for the people who are delivering the service, and safe for the environment. If you put all the pieces of work we do under that kind of umbrella, then we renew a portion of the asset and we maintain the rest of the asset to achieve these key objectives, for that. In terms of the report, I want to highlight, 3 or 4 key areas. We collaborate with NZTA to achieve some gradual improvements to our road capacity. Next week, on the 17th, will be the commencement of stage 1 of the improvements to the Eastern Corridor, a $17-18 million project. And that will see ongoing works for the next 12 to 18 months there. Concurrently with that, we'll be working with NZTA to complete the business case to extend those improvements all the way to the airport with appropriate political will. Another key project is the progression of the wastewater reticulation Rotorua. We are making significant progress into that project at the moment, and we are up in the open market to identify the pre-treatment systems for the Rotorua settlement. We are undertaking, as some elected members asked earlier, a final review of the functionality of the CBD with a view of coming to you in early March with some options to go public consultation. We're also completing very soon the safety review for 18 rural and lakes schools, as we were instructed last year, and those reports will be going to the Rural Community Board first for their input and then presented to the Council with the consequent outcomes. And as my colleague JP identified, in line with our housing objectives, we are now commencing a significant undertaking, a master planning for our stormwater management that is going to be a multi-year plan to guide our approaches to protecting and enabling the housing to take place. The rest of the information is as in the report, and more than happy to respond to questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Stavros. Any questions? Mayor Chadwick.
Stavros, I was just made aware over Christmas how busy you were with some of the heavy rainfall and also a raft of ratepayer meetings and some questions about Trinity. And we thought we were getting that paper quite early. Is that something that's coming to us soon? So the community seem to know, that we're looking at a new model, but when are we expecting that before us?
Yeah, we are all busy, of course, depending on the weather. But in terms of the wastewater services, as you have reported to the Council over the last couple of years, a procurement process identified a preferred supplier. We, over the last 12 months or so, we have undertaken a due diligence process in terms of the commercial risk transfer, financials, operations, and so on. And very soon we'll be reporting to you through workshops with a view of engaging with the public consultation, or to engage into the contract over the next few weeks. And then hopefully we'll conclude it to commence the transition by the beginning of the new financial year.
Councillor Maxwell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Stavros, just the last bullet point there. Can you just give me an update again on the Nongatawa roundabout and safety concerns through Nongatawa village?
Sure. As I said, very briefly, working with NZTA on a number of areas. One of that is the Eastern Corridor, Central Corridor revocation, and obviously the Western Corridor, of which the Nongatawa roundabout is a keynote. We're doing two pieces of work there with NZTA. One is a safety review of the Nongatawa village, and we'll have a concept hopefully over the next a couple of months to discuss with the council and the community. The roundabout enhancement, it's going through NZTA's funding process requirements. It's called entry business case to secure the funding for that. So we're working with them to make sure that it's consistent with our housing development and special plan ambitions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hurd.
Just further to that point, if I may, through you, Madam Chair. I live out there and come in there every day, and it's been apparent that since Christmas, that for some reason there's been a huge upsurge in the traffic. Yesterday morning, I received a video in my capacity at the chamber as from a public member who had come through there and had taken a video, was very frustrated by the traffic backed up beyond the 70k zone around the corner towards Dalworth Road. This morning I was hit, tailgated by a car behind me in Nongataha by the railway line. So that situation has got a lot worse for some reason since Christmas, and I can't explain it. It's been bad for a long time. So very pleased to hear that. And the other thing I just wanted to comment was the rural schools review. Thank you for that. We're very pleased to see that coming through, and all the good work that's happened there. Look forward to getting the report through the rural board. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hurd. Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Stavros, just a question about the engagement with NZTA over the traffic management with the stage 1 of Eastern Corridor. So do you know if they've done any modelling on what the effect of that, because experience with Fairy Springs 4-laning and Lake Road 4-laning has been that the public only wake up to it when the cones go up and it's down to 1 lane and things slow down and they're backed up past the airport, or they're diverting through Nongataha and aggravating the issue raised by Mr. Hurd. So has there been any sort of modelling done on just what the delays may be when that piece of work gets underway, and which end are they starting at? And my other question was around the $18 million. Now, originally that was flagged as about a $13 million investment. So is there $5 million of new money, or have we managed to move some from other areas? That's my question.
Very briefly, the construction-related traffic management plan is being worked at the moment by Downers, who is the contractor. We have some significant discussions with them, and the overarching principle we have asked them to adhere to is that it's to maintain two-lane traffic on each direction at all times. Having said that, it's a construction activity. From time to time, there might be some delays. We also directed them to model any, what we call a rat running through Linmo, Clancy Road and coming to Tarawera and Vaughan Road. So they're working into options to minimize the effect of that. However, if I sat here and told you that over the next 12 months, there will be no instances of some traffic, jamming, I will be probably lying through my teeth. I think the reality is that there will be some disruptions, and we'll work with them to continue to minimize them. In terms of funding, remember the initial funding for stage 1 was agreed back in 2015, actually. So it was 4 years ago. So again, as my colleague the CFO said earlier, when we do asset revaluations, you find out the actual asset valuations going up. So what it was valid in 2015 as an estimate for a construction work 4 years later, it's it's not unreasonable to see it going to for $17-18 million. So we're not doing more work. We basically the funding they got now reflects the actual market condition and the cost of doing works.
Supplementary, if I may, Madam Chair. So that also includes, I guess, our investment in new services, water mains and that sort of thing, as part of the project.
Yeah, that's correct. One of the things we are doing there, we're taking this opportunity, which basically would be, at least in my life, a lifetime opportunity to upgrade our water supply to the east. And again, bearing in mind we've got the housing ambition in that area, and we are enhancing the capacity of the water mains to go there. And we thought it was the right opportunity to use our available resources to do it now and be ready for the housing expectations.
Thank you. Councillor Yates.
Tēnā koe, Madam Chair. Also, it's not necessarily on here, but it does, for me, capture a little bit of Sala Street, which is NZTA. So it's been brought to my attention that trucks are still hoofing down there. Although it is a state highway, it's residential as well. Will there be any opportunity to redress the traffic in that residential area?
Mr. Yates, thank you. I think, it's quite important to note that NZTA is coming to council in early March with a presentation of their proposed speed limits, the traffic calming opportunities in the state highway. My expectation is that Sala Street will be treated like an arterial residential street, and might be an opportunity for you as elected members actually to emphasize those concerns to them. I have certainly emphasized them, but it'd be good for you to repeat it.
Thank you. Mr. Waru?
Okay, Madam Chair, my question's been answered. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Chadwick.
Just out of interest, when you're working with NZTA and you're talking about the Eastern Corridor and actually probably Nongataha and the Western planning there, do they ever mention and ask you about the potential to unlock residential, or do they see it just as a pipeline?
There is a tension always between the key purpose of existence of NZTA, which is a road management authority, and they're dominantly focusing on to managing effectively their transport network. The linking of a transport network, which is a derived outcome, with other expectations like housing, is an all-of-government approach.
Yeah.
And I think we try to emphasize to the government and NZTA that they need to talk amongst themselves. There are housing objectives and well-being objectives, environmental objectives and transportation objectives have to be aligned. I think we're making some progress in that direction. Hopefully over the next few weeks we get some good results.
Great.
Thank you. Were there any further questions of Stavros? Yes, Councillor Kaifong.
Thank you. Just one last question on the Eastern Corridor, where it says that work on the business case has actually been is on hold. So the rationale for that, given that we were talking with Eastgate, the airport development and the potential for Wharanui subdivision to be bigger if there is that, are we just simply putting it on hold because the money's not there, or is there some other rationale for an important piece of work not proceeding?
It's a bit of a long history behind that, but roughly the detailed business case is 99% complete. The detailed business case of 4-lane to the airport identified very clearly that the only viable long-term sustainable option is a 4-laning with improvements to the entrance to the airport, Eastgate, and so on. Last year, the NZTA was suffering shortage of funding, and obviously, in terms of relative priority, was lower down their spectrum of expectations. With a new funding for infrastructure announced recently by the government, it seems to be that NZTA believe that you can bring forward the business case. And I'm meeting with them on Monday the 10th, actually, to finish it off. And hopefully, at the political level, you will also make the right inroads into government's ears, so we can link our housing expectations because without four-laning work. Four-laning work is a necessary prerequisite for us to unlock the economic potential of the land on either side of the road. So it is not always easy, but we will try to be optimistic and work with them to achieve it.
Thank you. Well, if there's no further questions, that concludes the infrastructure group. Thank you, Stavros. I'd now like to invite our Chief Financial Officer back, Thomas Colley, to overview the business support group, which is on page 69 of our agenda.
Happy to take the report as read, and any questions?
Thank you, Thomas. Were there any questions? Yes, Mr. Waru.
Let you go, Thomas. Through you, Madam Chair. Just one question, because I remember last year you made the switch over to a new system, you were ironing out all the little kinks and things like that. Has that come to fruition yet, or you still sort of, in terms of payroll and all that kind of things?
So with reference to that's the One Council project. So phase one has been completed and we've been live 15, 18 months now, and that's the finance system. It's just gone through another upgrade, which we're just bedding down, and we're in phase two at the moment, which is replacing all of our regulatory functions and rating and document management. So that was scheduled to go live December this year, but there seems to be some delays with getting some technical resources. So we're now looking at about a go live in March 2021. And so we're just working with the vendor on understanding what that is. We replaced our payroll system recently, so that's been quite successful. And that was just in anticipation of that contract expiring shortly, and just finding the right opportunity to move to a more robust system.
Kia ora.
Thank you, Thomas. Well, the next item on our agenda is a resolution to go into public excluded. Now we have 3 confidential reports to be discussed today. The first is Clayton Road stormwater upgrade. Second is Margarita Street traffic management and road safety. And the third is the signs and street furniture maintenance. Now, the reasons for going into public excluded for this session is to firstly enable commercial or industrial negotiations, and secondly for commercial sensitivity. So I call for a mover and a seconder for the motion. Moves Mr. Waru, seconded Councillor McPherson, that the committee move into public excluded session. I put that motion to the vote. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. I'll just allow the public a few minutes just to exit, and I do note that we have a presentation to come as well after these reports.